The Subcommittee on Health will now come to order. Good morning, colleagues. The Chair now recognizes herself for filing an opening statement. I want to do my opening statement. I never thought we would be holding a hearing under these sad circumstances. But I think it's a necessary one. Hungry and jobless, and over 8,000 souls have been lost. And the government that was supposed to protect them has failed. There are heroes, and they have been extraordinary, ordinary Americans showing courage, compassion, and a sense of self-sacrifice and duty beyond what could have, should have been asked of them. Regular Americans have risen, and their leaders have not. We are the greatest country on earth, and yet we have the most cases and the most deaths of COVID-19. First is the inept, ineffective, and extremely late effort to respond to what was clear to many scientists and health experts in January. That basic delay cost precious lives and is continuing to cost lives. We can't have a system where the price paid is unconscionable. Mothers losing daughters, daughters losing fathers because of incompetence, delay, and a disorganized response. Frankly, I'm tired of those who bear the responsibility, accept none of it, while deflecting blame on others. The previous administration, the World Health Organization, the Wuhan lab, anywhere but where the blame belongs. Second, the United States has and remains dangerously dependent on foreign for our supply of critical life-saving drugs and life-saving equipment, masks, gloves, PPE, and ventilators. So we can't treat our own people without relying on China and others to supply us. We can't outfit our funders, our hospital workers, our nurses, our doctors. We can't care for our own nation in crisis. This surely is a national security issue. I want to thank the gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Brooks, for her bipartisan work with me to address the drug supply chain issue, as well as other members on a bipartisan basis for their legislation on those issues as well. Today, we're going to hear about the disastrous federal response to an approaching pandemic. Dr. Wright has filed the most specific and troubling whistleblower complaints I've ever seen. He was the right person, with the right judgment, at the right time. He was not only ignored, he was fired for being right. We can't have a system where the government fires those who get it right and reward those who get it completely wrong. Mr. Michael Bowen, the Executive Vice President of Meritech, will speak to America's crippling dependence on foreign countries for critical medical supplies, public health, and a national security issue. Our country is paying a terrible price today, and it rests on Congress to address this threat. Any effort of an adversary can cut off our supply of life-saving drugs and supplies, our lifeline. This would create a healthcare disaster on a scale never experienced before. I bear this responsibility, as does every member of Congress. This subcommittee has jurisdiction over our country's most prestigious healthcare institutions: FDA, NIH, CDC, been part of. We have to listen, we have to learn, and we must work together for the people of our country who need us so, so much, regardless of inconvenient truths. Finally, I regret the Secretary of Azar, Dr. Robert Cadlick, and Dr. Peter Navarro have all refused to testify today. I now ask for a moment of silence in honor of the over 80,000 Americans who have lost their lives in COVID.
This is a month ago. We're in that now.
Chair now recognizes. Gentleman's recognized. State is parliamentary inquiry.
Here, I just the inquiry is that my clarification witness before us today, is this witness testifying as a government witness or as an individual?
The doctor is testifying as a federal employee, correct? And representing, he is a federal employee representing himself. I now recognize the ranking member of the.
Yes. Just a question. Normally we have nameplates identifying who's at the table. I know Dr. Wright, of course, but I'm not sure who's next.
You're correct. I don't know why we don't have nameplates. I didn't notice that when I came into the hearing room. Can the staff provide, is there any way the staff can provide them? I think we can. Mm-hmm. I also would like to inform the members that Dr. Wright's attorney, Deborah Katz, is at the table. She has a microphone. She is not here as a witness, so we will not be asking her questions. She is here to representing her client. I now would like to recognize the ranking of the subcommittee, Dr. Burgess, for his 5 minutes for an opening statement.
I thank the chair. And the Energy and Commerce, particularly the Subcommittee on Health, is the premier health subcommittee in the Congress. We have a broad jurisdiction, a longstanding tradition of tackling their issues in a bipartisan manner. And personally, like our witness today, have been very, very concerned, and in fact sounding the alarm about this novel virus since January. So I ask, why is this the first official hearing that we're having on this topic? Say this is an understatement. Not only disappointment, but quite frankly, I'm concerned it took 5 months to have a hearing on this novel coronavirus. Explaining any of the issues suggested in the letters that I've sent to you this week, we are examining a whistleblower complaint that is only 1 week old for a proper investigation. In these letters, I outlined the importance of addressing the strategic national stockpile, COVID-19's impact on mental health, testing. Certainly we should have a hearing on testing, racial disparities, and provider relief. Lack of attention to these details is detrimental to our nation's overall response to this pandemic, and it is the responsibility of this House and the responsibility of this committee. We continue to stand on the sidelines, fully engaged. Every whistleblower deserves to be heard. Dr. Wright has raised serious allegations, and they deserve investigation. Whistleblowers must have their rights protected and deserve to have their allegations investigated with policy procedures that have been long established and upheld as independent and fair. Madam Chair, on April 23rd, CNN reported that you plan to call Dr. Wright to testify. Dr. Wright did not actually file his whistleblower complaint with the Office of Special Counsel until Tuesday, May 5th. That same day, it was announced on social media that you planned to hold a hearing, but it was not officially noticed until 2 days later. By Friday, The Office of Special Counsel recommended that Dr. Bright be temporarily reinstated as director of BARDA so that it could thoroughly conduct its investigation and move forward with its usual processes of reviewing whistleblower complaint. Despite the hearing memo, no final determination of whistleblower statute actually has been made. Following a robust investigation process, customary setting for a whistleblower hearing, our Energy and Commerce Committee under oath in the Office Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee. Say this hearing is premature, and it is a disservice to the investigations of Dr. Bright's complaint, I think goes without saying. You trampled on minority rights. You would have never tolerated that when you were in the minority. You neglected the tradition of this committee, and in the manner this hearing was called. The number of procedural fouls committed in advance of this hearing would certainly have led to a foul run of multiple basketball games. Apparently, in a world without sports, this subcommittee has become political sport. More than 1,000 American lives have been lost to this pandemic. It continues to wreak havoc on our communities, not only in terms of physical health, but mental health and certainly financial health. We should be conducting a hearing on the real-time implementation of the Pandemic All Hazard Preparedness and Advancing Innovation Act. And we've done it in February. As a Democratic counterpart to the primary author, Dr. Susan Brooks, on this legislation, you, Madam Chair, should have in holding such a hearing. In my district, we've seen deaths amongst young African Americans from COVID-19. We're hearing about a new phenomenon of very young individuals who are dying from an intense inflammatory response apparently sparked with this virus. Well, we should hear from some of these families and medical professionals to analyze why this virus has disproportionately affected some, particularly minority communities. So I've said it before, not all heroes wear capes. Hospitals, doctors, and other healthcare providers are on the front lines every single day. They go to work so we can stay home, which we've done very successfully. The inability to conduct non-essential procedures and visits has led to financial hospitals and doctors, now our states and the country preparing to ease back into providing medical care. Is the distribution of the Provider Relief Fund CARES Act working? These are the questions we should be asking the experts today. I appreciate Chairman Pelot's willingness to hold telephone briefings since we all have our own questions. But let me just say, this pandemic is about the public health of our nation. Thank you for your commitment to hold future hearings on the Strategic National Stockpile, mental health disparities. I'm happy to help you set the agenda for the rest of the year. I hope you will commit to additional hearings on testing and the Provider Relief Fund. And I request that your responses be part of the record. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I think the gentleman that I called for a hearing on January 30th. And on the heels of that, it was to be Cadlick, Dr. Fauci, all the heads of our health agencies, and it was Secretary Azar that cannot come. I'm the top person, and when I come, they will come with me. So that was January 30th.
Madam Chair, if I may, the oversight
I'm not finished yet.
subcommittee for 2 days.
I'm not finished yet. Dr. Burgess. You've written several letters to me last week, and I communicated to you. I'm happy to sit down with you to review and to come up with all the appropriate hearings that this subcommittee should hold. And we will work together on that. We have work to do. You're absolutely right. The stockpile, testing, the list is as long as Pennsylvania Avenue. So we will work together, rest assured. Now I'd like to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pelot, for his 5 minutes for an open.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Eshu, for initiating this hearing and putting all your energy into it so that we're here with Dr. Bright. We are here as part of the Energy and Commerce Committee's ongoing work to confront the largest public health and economic crisis lifetimes. As been mentioned, more than 80,000 Americans have lost their lives, while more than 36 million others have lost their jobs as of today. This is an issue that requires every aspect of government to work together to reduce the spread of this terrible virus so we can confidently begin to reopen our economy. And while this Congress and the President have worked together to enact 4 laws to combat the pandemic and provide economic assistance to the American people, new laws are simply not enough. President Trump and his administration have failed to provide the consistent and stable leadership that is necessary to guide our nation through this public health and economic crisis. The President has delivered mixed messages and misinformation to the American people, creating confusion across the nation. Instead of showing leadership, competence, in a time of crisis, the administration has abdicated its responsibility and forced states to fend for themselves and find their own way out of this pandemic. States and healthcare workers were pleading for personal protective equipment, testing supplies, and other resources to protect them and their patients. President Trump's response was to let states fight it out on the open market. For months, the president has refused to develop and implement a national testing program. For months, we've been promised millions right around the corner. The promises have been hollow. Testing is getting better, but nowhere near what it needs to be. It doesn't help that the president proclaimed about testing earlier, and I quote, "We have met the moment and we have prevailed." That could not be further from the truth, Mr. President. Dr. Rick Wright, the former director of BARDA, has come forward and made serious allegations, including a lack of urgency by administration officials to respond to the virus, mismanagement, and failure to procure supplies, and disregard for public health and scientific integrity. His claims lie at the heart of this committee's concerns regarding the administration's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We're here today to hear the perspective of Dr. Bright, who was positioned to discuss the administration's preparations and response to the pandemic. Now, the failures we've seen simply cannot persist. That's why the Energy and Commerce Committee continues to conduct robust oversight and to propose bold solutions. We've been demanding answers and information from the administration on testing, contact tracing, the supply chain, food safety, and the safety of workers, and attempts to undermine science and public health. To date, we have yet to receive any sufficient responses from the Trump administration. In that explanation, Congress has already passed 4 major coronavirus response packages that were improved by the work of this committee. And now, with the sense of urgency this moment, earlier this week, we proposed the HEROES Act, which is to be voted on tomorrow by the full House. The HEROES Act continues our ongoing commitment to providing the healthcare resources and support needed to combat the coronavirus crisis. Our legislation will strengthen testing and contact tracing by finally requiring the administration to develop comprehensive, clear benchmarks and timelines and public reporting of key metrics. This will allow transparency so we can see if the Trump administration is fulfilling their promise and hold them accountable if they're not. We also provide $75 billion to support robust testing, contact tracing, surveillance, and containment activity. This is beyond the 25 that was in the last bill, and we simply cannot beat this virus without these efforts in place. Our legislation also ensures that all COVID-19 treatments, drugs, and vaccines are free of cost for patients. It will help us shore up our public health infrastructure for the long road ahead. Our top priority is the safety of the American people. The HEROES Act builds on the progress we have made and lays the foundation we will need to ease social distancing and safely reopen the economy. So I just want to thank Dr. Bright for coming forward and for being here today. I want to thank you, Madam Chair, for bringing him here. And I'm hopeful that this hearing will help us better understand the failures of the Trump administration so that collectively we can find solutions that will help us finally get a handle on this virus. It's the only way we'll be able to protect the American people safely and confidently reopen our communities. And I thank you, Madam Chair, yield back.
Gentleman yields back. It's a
Madam
pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Oregon, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Logan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And before I use my time, I do have just a question for you, if you would yield to that. Madam Chair,
You can state your parliamentary.
So I know under really unusual conditions. I
We
get
are.
because of the mess and everything else, which also affects the layout of the room. I know when we do oversight and investigation hearings, I know that's not what we're doing here. There is a script about whether an individual is accompanied by counsel, whether they want that counsel representative. Not that script. The reason I'm asking is we're not in O&I, but it is extraordinarily unusual to have a government witness individual with private counsel at the witness table and with a microphone. And so I'm just trying to get clarification for future precedent setting for the committee, and that's the reason I'm asking this. Obviously, counsel. If we should follow the protocol that is prescribed inside investigations committee in similar circumstances.
Well, I think this is the first time that
That's why I asked.
we have another first here. When Dr. Wright came in this morning with his attorney, she requested a microphone. And courtesy, I extended the microphone to her.
Yeah, sure.
Now, she's not a witness. She will not going to ask her questions. She simply accompanied the client. So I don't.
And no objection to any of that. It's just that. Did I read you what this text is? Maybe that resolves it.
Well, this isn't O&I. This is. Are
Right.
you suggesting that we need to follow what O&I does?
I'm just saying that it is. The witness is not his whistleblowing capacity is what I'm told. But this is his personal attorney, if I understand correctly, but we still don't even sure. I know who you are, but we haven't identified that correctly.
This is.
And
this is really
all we
the
do
best.
in O&I, as you
Listen
know,
to
is
this
ask
sliding.
if the witness wants to be
Study
accompanied by
for
counsel. They
centuries of
respond.
what not
Yes,
to
sir.
do.
And then counsel is allowed to move forward, sit at the table, and the question is asked, will you give testimony or not? If so, raise your hand, all these things. That's all I'm doing here, is just, we don't usually do this type of activity in the other policy committees. And we're not usually set up this way, but
So would
because
you
of the
like to ask
pandemic, we are. I just think we ought to follow that for future precedent issues. Nothing to do with this hearing, but future precedent.
it's a good suggestion.
We're all learning how to operate in this environment.
Exactly. All right, the gentleman is recognized for his 5-minute opening statement.
Well,
We don't think it's resolved.
well, are we going to ask if he wants to be represented by counsel, and then who the counsel is?
Dr. Bright, do you present it by counsel?
Yes.
Okay. Then she identify herself for the
And
record.
for the group, would counsel please state your name?
It's Deborah Katz.
This isn't normal procedure. He just and to make it look stupid.
That's all we need to do.
Thank
The gentleman is
Did?
recognized for his
Well,
5
you've got a
minutes.
Parliamentary question. So,
The gentleman state his parliamentary.
yeah, will the witness be under oath? Have a witness, whistleblower testimony under O&I, a witness would normally be under oath, and if not
She's not a
today,
witness.
he's under oath, not under oath, then into whistleblower allegations, how can we be assured that the witness is telling the truth under oath if they're not under oath? How can you talk about the whistleblower complaints
I thank the
in
gentleman.
a fair and equitable manner?
I thank the gentleman for his inquiry. All witnesses know that it is illegal to lie to Congress.
All
And
witnesses
in our
know.
subcommittee,
Except for
unlike
Congress
they are the only subcommittee that, I mean, it's a practice, it's a tradition, but we don't swear people in. But witnesses know that it is illegal to lie to Congress.
That's only 1,003.
Mhm.
I'm ready.
Most welcome.
Thank you.
Gentleman is recognized for his 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I know we're operating under unique circumstances. coping with an historic, deadly pandemic that we always knew was possible.
It's the month old.
We prayed would not happen.
This is Mr.
In a
Walden.
bipartisan way, we did
Greg
everything
Walden.
the experts
Okay.
said to be prepared should a pandemic or other hazard strike. Madam Chair, the work you, Dr. Burgess, Representative Susan Brooks, and I, and others did when each party has controlled the House resulted in one product, the Pandemic All Hazards Preparedness Act. Dr. Wright, you were part of our efforts in writing and reauthorizing that law. We thank you for your work. In fact, given the role you once played at ASPR before, you had a big responsibility to make sure Congress provided the strategic national stockpile that it needed, or to inform us if there were shortcomings, especially as we were modernizing the Pandemic All Hazards Preparedness Act. I went back over 3 hearings we held in the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee of this committee, where you testified regarding the outbreak in May 23rd of 2017, the seasonal flu on March 8th, 2018, the hearing on June 15th, 2018, entitled State of U.S. Public Health Preparedness, Responding to Biological Attacks, Pandemics, and Emerging Infectious Disease Outbreaks. See, I want to make sure we haven't missed anything. Nothing out of me as I reread the record. Congress dramatically increased funding to ASPR and BARDA. We granted new authorities. We followed your recommendations and those of others who played in this combined effort. Unfortunately, some of the systems we put in place to prepare for a pandemic, systems designed without actually living through something like this, formed as expected. We've learned we didn't have enough of the basic supplies that we've always taken for granted. While Chair Eshoo and I have warned about the potential vulnerabilities of our medical chains, especially from China, not enough was done to address the problem, and it still hasn't been fully addressed. I'm thankful that President Trump invoked the Production Act to ramp up U.S. manufacturing of masks and ventilators. The president's used the emergency powers and money Congress has provided to launch unprecedented efforts to search the globe for supplies, rapidly advance development of treatments and vaccines. But we still have much bipartisan work to do to respond and adapt to the challenges presented by COVID-19 and the lessons we're learning. We have asked for, and this committee should hold hearings to find a path forward to reform the strategic national stockpile. We increase domestic manufacturing of critical supplies and disentangle our supply chains from China. We should be exploring strategies for increased testing so we can begin to safely reopen the economy. We need to find ways to improve access to mental health and provide relief both for our healthcare providers on the front lines treating COVID-19 cases and our healthcare who have been furloughed because their hospitals are closed. We should be conducting rigorous oversight of the trillions of dollars and myriad new policies Congress has appropriated and enacted rights that raise concern about our nation's coronavirus response. That does not appear to be why we're actually here today, and frankly, it saddens me. Dr. Wright, your allegations are serious. They deserve a real investigation. I know the offices whom you filed your complaint will do just that. And I know they take their work seriously and will hear you out. And importantly, will give those named in your complaint an opportunity to have their as well. I must tell you that many of us on our committee were confused when we learned from a tweet this hearing was scheduled in the wake of your complaint. As you know, that certainly things at the Energy and Commerce Committee. Not long after the notice of this being a whistleblower hearing, we were advised you were here as a government witness, not a whistleblower, but then we were told you were representing government, but yourself. The hearing title suggests the hearing is about protecting scientific integrity, yet the chair invited a witness who will not be speaking. So it's all pretty confusing and unusual to say the least. Here we are in the middle of a pandemic, and we aren't given time to secure our witnesses, conduct research, or require documents that could aid in our understanding of the situation you face and the country faces.
Well, you had a
First
month.
discussion with the majority,
What's
unfortunately,
that?
just occurred 3 days. This is really serious business. But in my opinion, this is not the way we should run an investigation. We need to get to the heart of the matter. We need to move forward and say, what haven't we done right? As Congress and the country, what can we band together and fix before fall arrives? And so I thank you for being here, for working with you over the years, and continue to look forward to working with you and others to get this right. And Madam Chair, we have a letter asking for a Rule 11 hearing that we'll provide to you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair I'd like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements will be made part of the record. I would now like to introduce our first panel today. Dr. Rick Wright is a highly regarded scientist with expertise in the fields of therapeutics, vaccine, and diagnostic development. For the last decade, he's been a career civil servant at the Department of Health and Human Services. In 2016, Dr. Wright was appointed Director of BARDA, the third Director of BARDA, the Biomedical Research and Development Authority. As Director of BARDA, he has testified before Congress as a government expert numerous times, including the subcommittee. I share a special pride with Senator Richard Burr because together it was our legislation that created. So thank you for your willingness to join us today and to offer testimony, Dr. Bright. We look forward to your testimony. You're familiar with the lights. I don't need to explain those to you. You have 5 minutes for your statement. Welcome, and put the microphone on. There we go. Good morning to you.
Good morning,
This is the
Chairwoman Asher
whistleblower.
and Ranking Member Burgess and the state of the subcommittee. I am Dr. Rick Wright, a career public servant and a scientist who has spent 25 years of my career focused on addressing pandemic outbreaks. I have a bachelor's degree in biology and physical sciences and a PhD in immunology and molecular pathogenesis. I had teams of scientists developing drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics in government, private industry, and for nonprofit organizations. I'm here today in private capacity. The views are my own and not those of the Department of Health and Human Services. I joined BARDA in 2010, and for the last 3.5 years, until April 21st of this year, I had the privilege of serving as its director. BARDA partners with private industry and others in governments to address national security threats. Today, the world is confronting a public health emergency unlike any we've seen in over a century. We are facing a highly transmissible and deadly virus, which not only claims lives, but also disrupts the very foundations of our society. The American healthcare system is being taxed to the limit. Our economy is spiraling downward. Our population is being paralyzed by fear, stemming from a lack of a coordinated response and an accurate, clear communication about the path forward. Americans yearn to get back to work, to open their businesses, and to provide for their families. Get that. However, what we do must be done carefully with guidance from the best scientific minds. The window of opportunity is closing. If we fail to improve our response now, based on science, I fear the pandemic will get worse and be prolonged. There will be likely a resurgence of COVID-19 this fall and will be greatly compounded by the challenges of seasonal influenza. Without better planning, 2020 would be the darkest winter in modern history. First and foremost, we need to be truthful with the American people. Americans deserve truth. The truth must be based on science. We have the world's greatest scientists. Let us lead. Let us speak without fear of retribution. We must listen. Each of us can and must do our part now. On Tuesday, Dr. Fauci delivered a message in a voice that is clear and trustworthy, encouraged us to act with caution as we return to our daily lives. We should listen to him and other scientists sharing their expertise. While waiting for a cure and a vaccine, which I believe will come, there are things we must do immediately. We must increase the public education about the basics, washing hands, social distancing, appropriate face covering. They're simple but critical steps to buy valuable time until there's vaccine. We need to ramp up production of equipment and supplies, including raw materials and critical components. Shortages of these increase the risk of our frontline healthcare workers. They deserve the equipment to protect themselves. We need to facilitate equitable distribution of essential equipment and supplies. And finally, we need a national testing. The virus is here. It's everywhere. We need to be able to find it, isolate it, and stop it. We need to have the right for everyone who needs it. We need to be able to trace contacts, isolate, quarantine, and appropriately while striving to develop a cure. Initially, our nation was not as prepared as we should have been, as we could have been. Some scientists used early warning signals that were overlooked, and pages from our pandemic playbook were ignored by some in leadership. There will be plenty of time to look back to assess what has happened so we can improve. But right now, we need to focus on getting things right going forward. We need a plan that everyone knows and everyone participates in. Congress has taken important steps to support the response, and there's much more we can do. With your help in this crisis, working cooperatively with our global partners, we can and will succeed in finding a cure for COVID-19. But that success is what we do today. We will either be remembered for what we did or for what we failed to do to address this crisis. I call on all of us to act to ensure the health, safety, and prosperity of all Americans. You can count on me to do my part. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bright. We'll now move to member questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Thank you again, Dr. Bright. You have a distinguished career. You're one of our country's leading public health experts on how to respond to pandemics and national security health threats. You're the first government official who's been on the inside, seeing everything firsthand, to come forward and share unvarnished experiences about what really happened from January to the time you departed in April of this year, dealing with the virus. So I want to make sure I understand what you're telling us. You stated in your written testimony, a window of opportunity is closing, but it is not yet closed. What do we need to do with the time left to get it right? And if we don't, what do you mean when you say 2020 will be the darkest winter in modern history?
Very well, Ashley, thank you for your question. The window is closing to address this pandemic. We still do not have a standard, centralized, coordinated plan to take our nation through this response. I believe that leadership and collaboration across government, with the best science leading the way, we can devise a comprehensive strategy. We can devise a plan that includes all of Americans and help us guide us through this pandemic. The time is running out because the virus is still spreading everywhere. People are getting restless to leave their homes. We have to make critical decisions on how to balance the science. My concern about this fall is compounded by my knowledge and preparation in response to many years of influenza outbreaks, pandemic influenza outbreaks, and seasonal influenza outbreaks. In our country in 2017, we had nearly 79,000 people die in the US influenza. That, coupled with a COVID-19 resurgence this fall, will be devastating for our healthcare systems and for Americans. Limited window of opportunity to get plans in place to address both of those.
Thank you. When you look at the first 4 months of this year, did you do the government's and the administration's response as a success or a failure?
We could have done better. I believe there are critical steps that we did not take in time.
Is there a failure to respond when you correctly pushed to claim early virus samples from, or to obtain early virus samples from China so we could develop critical medical countermeasures?
My perspective in working with companies to develop drugs and vaccines and diagnostic, viral samples are critical. As soon as we were aware that this virus could pose a significant threat lives. I began pushing for those virus samples, and I met frustration and
When
dismissal.
did you do that?
I did that in the office of the Secretary of Liaison in January. The push for the virus samples initially mentioned on January 23rd, and a strong push on January 27th for those virus samples.
And was there a failure to respond with the needed urgency when you correctly pushed to ramp up production of masks, respirators, syringes, swabs?
Congresswoman, we've known for quite some time that our stockpile is insufficient in having those critical personal protective equipment. So once this virus became spreading and became known to be a threat, I did feel quite concerned that we didn't have those supplies. I began pushing urgently in January, along with some industry colleagues as well. And those urges, those alarms were not responded to with action.
Was there a failure to take immediate action when you correctly pushed to additional doses of the drug remdesivir, which is the only drug so far that has appears to be at least mild effective, thank God, for treating people with COVID-19?
There was no action taken on the urgency to come up with a plan for acquisition of limited doses of remdesivir, nor to distribute those limited doses of remdesivir once we had the scientific data to use for people infected with this virus.
And instead of acting on your recommendations, was the response of others to try and cut you out of key meetings, marginalize?
I was told that my urgings were causing a commotion, and I was removed from those meetings.
My time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Dr. Burgess.
I thank the chair. And Dr. Bright, I hope as it is clear to you, everyone was biased on both sides. I appreciate you coming before us today. We are frustrated having this hearing without full understanding of the facts. Just to clarify, your test capacity and not on behalf of the agency or the administration.
That's correct, sir.
Thank you for that. Let me ask you, categorically, even maybe a little bit more broadly, the disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs that are looked at for therapy for this disease. I asked about hydroxychloroquine because it does seem to be central to whatever disagreement you had with HHS and the administration. But hydroxychloroquine was initially identified potential therapeutic because of one of its anti-inflammatory effects, its ability to calm things in the immune system. And as we know, this disease is the overwhelming cytokine response that overwhelms the host. Also, an effect of blocking the virus at the point of contact with the cell. Certainly something that probably deserves a little attention. But again, it's not the only one. There were some other drugs. I think, if I'm correct, Margaret, supported with investments. Terma and Kevzara, which are thought to have similar impacts on the ability to suppress the cytokine responses. Am I correct in that?
There are a number of drugs that we were evaluating initially, Congressman, that really had an impact if they were safe to use in patients infected with this virus.
Do you have available the dollar amounts that were authorized for each of those?
There's available with me now.
Would you be able to make them available?
I believe HHS could make those available, part of the investments available.
Were you concerned with hydroxychloroquine at the time you made those awards for Acterm and Kevzara? Was the concern with hydroxychloroquine and similar medications?
This safety review that we received from the interagency group of clinicians and regulatory experts and scientists. At the time that we learned about hydroxychloroquine, there was limited data available, and our proposal and actions were to see if we can identify a source of that drug. The NIH could conduct randomized controlled clinical study. It's a similar action we took with remdesivir. Once we thought remdesivir had promise from data coming from China, NIH quickly established a clinical study, a randomized controlled study to evaluate remdesivir. So with hydroxychloroquine, that was also our preferred plan of action.
And you, of course, authored the letter to the FDA asking for the emergency use authorization.
The director from the office of the HHS secretary put in place and expanded Americans through a unique opportunity under close supervision of a healthcare provider. During that,
And of course, this hearing, not really a hearing on hydroxychloroquine, I, of course, would welcome a robust hearing on therapeutics and the research that's going on, what we've invested seems to be panning out, what has not. I'll note that both Kizara and the other medication may not have panned out. And I think the manufacturing company, Kizara, announced that they'll discontinue part of the clinical study because it looked unlikely to help COVID patients. But let me tell you, since starting this, since you identified that this hearing got noticed, I'm hearing from a lot of doctors, my state, around the country, who have experience using chloroquine, coupled with erythromycin and zinc. And they're reporting significant benefit if used early enough in the course and may eliminate the need for hospitalization and ventilatory support.
Gentlemen's
I
time is
don't know if
expired.
that's right. I think it's
Gentlemen's time is
important enough
expired.
that we should look into it, and would just be interested if you did that as part of your duties at Barton.
The gentleman's time is expired. The
Yes,
chair
ma'am.
now
Can I answer the question?
recognizes,
Would the witness be able to answer the question?
so I believe it's important those anecdotal stories as well. And they were not conducted in the context of a randomized controlled clinical study. It's very difficult to understand the data from the observational studies or anecdotal stories. So the drug might have some benefit in some populations, but we won't know that until we have that information from a truly controlled clinical study. Many of those studies are ongoing now. Some of those studies we're starting to see data from, and those studies in those populations tested an overwhelming evidence of benefit from use of hydroxychloroquine in those patients. The different studies are devised to look at different angles of it, as you described.
Most of those studies are when someone's on.
gentleman's time is expired.
You do those studies
Chair
without the drug, though.
recognizes
You need to acquire the drug.
Ranking, the gentleman's
studies.
time, please. We all want to be fair to each other. The gentleman's time is expired. The chair recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me just say, Dr. Bright, thank you for your courage in being here. When I was younger, by President Kennedy called Profiles in Courage. And, you know, your courage of being here reminds me of some of the people I read about in that book. I am concerned, Dr. Bright, that the Trump administration does not have plans for a nationwide vaccine program to ensure that once a vaccine is approved, to quickly make it available to everyone. In other words, I don't want to see the same mistakes by the Trump administration, the incompetence that they had with the supply chain and repeated with the vaccine. And you stated at the outset of the pandemic in January, you began urgently pressing HHS officials to provide the necessary resources to begin vaccine development, that your pleas fell on deaf ears. And as the pandemic progressed, you also stated you were alarmed by the pressures coming from officials for your agency to invest in drugs and vaccines, I quote, without proper scientific vetting or that lacked scientific merit. Where we are now in the hunt for a vaccine and where we could have been had the HHS leaders made investment decisions sooner that were scientific merit.
Thank you, Congressman. As we all know, vaccines are very difficult to make. This is nothing you can do quickly. You need multiple shots on goal to try to make a vaccine. There are many diseases we've attempted to make vaccines for through history, and we still haven't been able to do so. So many opportunities and many different approaches. Right now, there are over 100 different approaches for developing a vaccine for this coronavirus. So we're confident, hopefully, I should say, at least one of those or two of those will work, but you've identified key critical challenges that we need to anticipate and prepare for early. is the supply chain for those vaccines, needed reagents and buffers and salts and various ingredients that go into a vaccine, as well as the glasses that the vaccines are put into, needles and syringes, and then a carefully coordinated distribution and administration strategy. We haven't yet gotten to those downstream strategies yet in our government, and I think those are going to become a significant issue down the road if we don't plan for that now. The urgent need for funding outset of a pandemic is something we've known about for many years of pandemic exercises. Even in our August 2019 Crimson Contagion exercise, that we would need at least $10 billion from the outset of the pandemic to start the development of drugs and vaccines. Every day we delays the output of that vaccine or drug. And so in those early days, my first meeting with Secretary Azar, I asked for funding for people for those viruses, the three critical things to get started. It took some time to get the funding available through various processes. What BARDA did is we began to look internally at other contract programs we had, redirect some available funding, some minimal funding, even as early as January, be able to initiate contracts or agreements with some companies, start working on those vaccines as soon as possible. It's because of those actions now that not only have those vaccines started and made some progress, but also the United States has a placeholder with some of those companies to be able to place orders for those vaccines when they are available. We did everything possible to ensure that those investments were in companies that would build capacity in the United States to manufacture those vaccines. We had to get in line first. We wasn't fully there to complete the development program. That's what we did.
I guess my concern is, I'm very critical of administration in terms of, I call it incompetence with the supply chain, with lack of testing. I'm afraid the same thing's going to happen with vaccines, and once it's distribution. I mean, should I be concerned based on your experience?
Absolutely, sir. We're already seeing those challenges with limited doses of remdesivir, and that we're getting that remdesivir has some benefit in people. And we have limited doses, and we haven't scaled up production, and we don't have a plan on how to fairly and actively that drug. You can imagine this scenario this fall or winter, maybe even early next spring, when vaccine becomes available. There's no one company that can produce for our country or for the world any limited supplies. We need to have a strategy and plan in place now to make sure that we can not only build that vaccine, make it, administer it in a fair and equitable plan.
And that's not the case at this
We don't have that yet, and it is a significant concern.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back. I now have the pleasure of recognizing the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, witness, for being here. I want to get some clarification. So BARDA's job is to do the vaccines, right?
That is one of BARDA's roles, yes, to support industry.
Okay. Is it BARDA's responsibility to direct the personal protective equipment acquisition and distribution, PPE, or your responsibility at BARDA?
BARDA plays a role in pandemic preparedness for our nation, and we prepare and align and exercise with our other federal agencies. We also are familiar with the critical gaps in the supply chain. While BARDA isn't responsible for procuring those items for the Strategic National Stockpile, there are shortages in those needs. What I was doing in my capacity as BARDA director was raising those concerns and needs with the appropriate group within ASPR, the Strategic National Stockpile.
ASPR basically has the responsibility to go do that, right? That's not your direct responsibility. You're obviously in this discussion.
Needs a whistleblower telling on them for not
It's
doing
my
it.
responsibility to raise a significant concern about a limited supply or shortage that I think will affect the lives of
Did
Americans.
you raise that concern with people up here on Capitol Hill? And if so, who would?
I raised that concern with my
Thank you.
leadership, sir. I raised it with the appropriate folks in the Strategic National Stockpile and our critical infrastructure protection program.
Not up here.
My role is to raise it to
Just
so
everybody.
I also did raise that concern though in the White House with Mr. Navarro.
Yeah, I'm interested because we're passing these bills. In the future, you would, or anybody out there listening to these agents, if you're spotting something that's not working right, We need to know.
Yeah,
Isn't that
that's
the
why he's
first
sitting
case of
there, you
SARS-CoV-2
dumbass. That's right.
by the January 22nd in Washington State. CDC put the positive specimen in culture that day, correct?
I think it's January 20th.
It's my understanding the samples from the virus were made available to the U.S. government, and that the CDC expanded the virus January 29th and February 3rd and shared the BEI on February 4th to enable broad sharing. Now, according to your complaint, samples were available to the U.S. government from the Washington State case, and potentially even after the CDC's effort to grow the virus and then share with the BEI biorepository, you were still seeking to obtain a sample of the virus, correct?
That's true, sir. We need more than one virus.
Right. Why were the strains not available within the U.S. government, not available to you? Were they available to you?
There was viruses in January because we wanted to make sure that we had a head start on developing the vaccine.
Yeah, no, I get that.
And they became available in February, I believe it's February 6th, through the BEI resources. Then those were distributed to laboratories.
Did you ask for the virus sample from Washington State? That was part of that. You did?
We asked to make sure we had access to those viruses, and they were distributed to the right laboratories and the right companies.
And where did you ultimately get the virus that you distributed?
Some of those viruses came from the BEI resources, NIH, and some of those viruses came from laboratories that received from the CDC.
Okay, that's helpful to know. In some conversations I've been a part of with some at NIH, they indicated that the key here was to get the DNA sequence, which China did eventually put up, I believe, at the end of December, early January. And that in terms of going after the vaccine, it was that sequencing that really mattered most to get started on vaccine development. And there are scientists who are very distinguished who believe that the delay in getting the virus sample actually did set them back. Is that an accurate assessment, or do you have a disagreement? I'm kind of hearing that having the sequencing really mattered most, and getting virus important, but did not set them back in proceeding to get the vaccine and vaccine development.
And certainly the 11. It's important to understand that the sequence is available. When a sequence is available, some common technologies can get started with that sequence information.
And
Still are vulnerable because you have another country in their laboratory posted on a net or a database their sequence. There could still be challenges, especially for national security, about the integrity of that sequence.
Yeah, before my time runs out, it's run out. Just going to ask, did they begin efforts at that time once they got the sequence?
The NIH began efforts on a synthetic messenger RNA vaccine candidate. However, without the boxes, you really cannot tell if the neutralizing antibodies elicited by that, or your diagnostics, or your therapeutics can actually work. You can try to synthesize the sequence, but it's never going to be representative of the actual virus. When we're spending billions of dollars on drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics, we want to have the most credible information possible.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back. Pleasure to
Yes.
recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When would you bet that you would time the vaccine?
It's a very difficult question to answer. I know that there are companies and academic labs working very hard. Normally it takes up to 10 years to make the vaccine. We've done it faster in emergency situations. But for a novel virus, it's actually haven't been done yet. So a lot of them is swirling around a 12 to 18 month time frame. Everything is perfect.
Done.
We've never seen everything go perfectly.
Listen to
My
this.
concern is too quickly and consider cutting out critical steps. We may not have a full assessment of the safety of that vaccine, so it's still going to take some time. I still think 12 to 18 months is an aggressive schedule, and I think it's going to take longer than that to do so.
months from now, or up to 18 months from
Holy
when this
cow.
all started at the beginning of the year?
It would be 12 to 18 months from when the particular manufacturer made the material or information that they needed to start developing that vaccine. It's critical to note when we say 12 to 18 months, it doesn't mean for an FDA, not efficacy, to be able to use on an emergency basis. That is the consideration that we have in mind when we talk about an accelerated timeline.
Wow.
Thank you. I represent New York, Bronx County, and Westchester County, the epicenter in the U.S. Coronavirus outbreak, New York. Well, New York really rallied together and supported their neighbors. The administration has failed at every turn. President sidelined our best science, which baseless conspiracy theories, and more recently prescribed unproven remedies like Lysol to suffering Americans. Since the early days of the outbreak, the President encouraged doctors to prescribe chloroquine to suffering Americans despite a lack of evidence to use. On April 24th, the President's handpicked FDA commissioner came out against the use of chloroquine for COVID-19 care. Doctor, what are the dangers of chloroquine prescribed incorrectly? And what happened when you raised the issue of chloroquine use in virus patients with HHS leadership?
Chloroquine in were infected with this coronavirus. There are data of effective use and safe use of chloroquine in malaria patients and other potential safety risk of chloroquine cause irregular heart rhythms, and even in some cases death. Concerned with limited information and knowledge, especially those used in COVID-19 infected patients, and the potential for the carefully controlled clinical study under close watchful eye the physician so they could respond to them if they did experience one of those adverse events. There wasn't sufficient data at that time to support use of this drug in patients with COVID-19 with physician supervision.
When you raise that issue of chloroquine use in coronavirus patients with HHS leadership,
I believe part of the rap that I gave asked me to put in place an expanded access protocol that would make it more freely available to Americans that were not under close supervision of a physician and may not be confirmed to be infected with the coronavirus. And since the FDA, BARDA, NIH, and CDC worked hard to switch that to an emergency use authorization with strict guardrails that the patients would still confirmed to be infected with this virus under close supervision of a doctor, and who could not otherwise participate in a randomized controlled study. My concerns alleviated somewhat by being able to lock that in the stockpile with those conditions. However, my concerns were escalated when I heard that leaders in the Department of Health and Human Services were pushing to make that drug available outside of this emergency use authorization, to flood New York and New Jersey with this drug, regardless of state. And when I spoke outside of our government and shared my concerns for the American public, that I believe was a straw that broke the camel's back, escalated my removal.
thank you, Madam Chair.
Gentleman's time has
Fired
expired.
for it.
Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie. 5 minutes of questions.
Letting them all go.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Wright, for being here. We appreciate it very much. Reading to your complaint, that's kind of, I think the chairman said earlier, talked about the lack of urgency and why is the president's lack of urgency. I think most of my constituents want to know if things are getting done and where is the president is. And you're having issues with the leadership of Health and Human Services, and you're giving them recommendations. So if they're not accepting your recommendations to them, I think fairly surmise they're not passing that on to the White House. So the president's probably unaware of what you're putting forward. As it said, reading from your complaint on page 2, unfortunately, White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro shared Dr. Wright's sense of urgency. That's in sense of urgency. So talking in the White House, so you have a meeting with him on Saturday. He calls you back in on Sunday. You prepare your recommendations in a memo for Mick Mulvaney. He's essentially the president. And then, so you get around the leadership of HHS, meet essentially with the president, since with memorandum, the memorandum of Dr. Calic and HHS to implement Navarro's recommendations. The push by the White House for HHS swiftly created tension between Dr. Wright and HHS political leadership. So it seems that I don't know how you could be more urgent in government than having a meeting on Saturday and memorandum on Sunday and Monday once it got to the president's attention at the president's level. So we appreciate the president moving forward on that.
Yeah, we got it.
I'm on the ranking member of O&I, which that's what she testified. We appreciate that very much. So I'm kind of looking more at the process of putting this hearing together and some things as we read through your complaint. The only way we made it public, and in your complaint, there are different exhibits that you talk about, and we're having a hearing today and post or something like that is how we will make documents available to the state. Yeah. So the three exhibits that are not made public, the reference you complaint, would you make those available to the committee? You have those and make them available to the committee. I mean, if we're using your complaint, then we need to have the document.
Yeah, that's it.
Sure, I don't have a problem.
Yes, we will take that under. Maybe privacy considerations in some documents, so we do need to look at.
So also, if you read through the email chains that are made available, some appear complete, but some truly aren't. They're apparently not full. And so you will wonder if the context of the email would relate to the inferences taken from the emails. Would you make all the complete email chains available?
I'd like to address that as well. Wright was removed from his position. He was locked out of his email. It's
Boom.
not just through his phone email.
That's right.
The email chain. So the email chains that you have available, we have.
That's correct.
I can
He does
address
not have full set of
access.
I see, and that's exactly right. So I was immediately locked out of my email on like April 20th of this year. And so I didn't have full available to me and that. However, I believe I laid a solid foundation in my complaint, as detailed as I could be, for the Office of Special Counsel to conduct an investigation. I believe as part of their investigation, they'll be able to access those emails and individuals to get a full story information so they can get to the bottom.
It would have been helpful for us as well. Have you shared any of these exhibits with the majority that's not been shared with us? Majority side.
4 years.
I believe you have probably what's available in the public domain, and I believe the rest have been submitted to the Office of the Special Counsel. I haven't made that available to anyone directly.
To the gentleman, the minority and majority members, all emails that was available, that was in the public domain.
Just one more, or any other documents in possession or accessible to you included as exhibits in the complaint that are nonetheless relevant to your allegations. So we provide those to you.
I believe I provided the information available to me at this point. If I had access to my email from HHS, there might be additional supporting information in that email. I do not know the status if that's been deleted or wiped, or I just haven't had access to it.
So I appreciate your answers. Thank you very much.
The gentleman goes back, recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and to you, Dr. Bright. Thank you, sir, and thank you, most importantly, for your 25 years of public service. Dr. Bright, I'd like to ask you about your efforts to address supply shortages during COVID-19 tests. According to your account, as COVID-19 testing wrapped up, you asked for an inventory of the strategic national supply of testing supplies, including swabs, viral transport materials, and extraction buffers. You learned that the national stockpile did not stock these items. After that, you learned that FDA's source of swabs was a manufacturer in the region of Italy, which was the center of the COVID-19 outbreak industry. It is my understanding that this information then prompted you to reach out to the DoD agency previously assisted your office with international transportation of supplies related to Ebola. My question is, why, sir, did your office DoD at this point?
So it was part quite a surprise to me that the urgent ramp up of testing did not work, as you mentioned, swabs, viral transport media buffers, etc. So quite alarmed to learn from sitting behind CDC Director Redfield that we were going to experience a shortage of swabs. And I was even more surprised that there are strategic national stockpile did not plan or have any of those in supply. So my urgency to find solutions in that was supported by the FDA director of the Center for CDRH, this devices and diagnostics at FDA. And once I confirmed that there was a shortage, it was critical that we find a solution. And by partnering with our Department of Defense colleagues who worked with us for the Ebola response, we actually worked with them to ship doses of Ebola vaccine from Africa. So it was a natural occurrence or response for me and my department to come up with a solution to that critical supply.
Let me ask you this: were there any restrictions in place in Italy that would require Secretary Azar to move forward with the request?
What we needed to enact that air bridge with the Department of Defense was we needed our Secretary Azar to make a request of the Secretary. And I and my colleague, Dr. Gary Dispro, raised this issue at our senior leadership meeting with Dr. Cadillac, who asked her. And it clearly was not a topic that he wanted to discuss on that day. And actually, we were rebuffed by him saying we want to talk about swabs right now. And both Dr. Dispro and I raised this concern repeatedly in that call. So knowing that it was critically sensitive and we had a critical shortage of these swabs, I placed a call to Mr. Navarro's office once again and asked if Mr. Navarro could offer some assistance contacting the Secretary of Defense, the clearance for DoD to put those airplanes in place under the contract we have. And that happened a very quick turnaround, a matter of minutes. With that permission from the Secretary of Defense, we were able to start those flights within 2 days. We now transferred back over 20 swabs.
Are you saying that you alerted White House Advisor Peter Navarro about starting these flights to transport the swabs?
Yes, sir.
Seems like a logical response to the analysis that you provided. What is truly perplexing to me why anyone would resist such an initiative. And that's a rhetorical question. I won't ask you to answer that. Finally, we still don't have enough testing. I don't understand how and why that is possible. I understand that converting an auto plant to ventilators might take a little time, but how can we be struggling to get coronavirus outbreak?
And so there is no master coordinated plan on how to respond to this outbreak. We don't have a strategy or plan in place that identifies each of those critical components, and we don't have a designated agency that is sourcing those critical components, coming up with a strategy to make sure that we have those supplies when we need them. This comprehensive national strategy that's end-to-end about what includes every component to make sure we can respond and protect American lives.
Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for his 5 minutes questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Appreciate it. It seems like Mr. Navarro is doing a good job in answering the questions. I do wish we had the information available. And one of the reasons why it's not your fault. I wish we had done this with regular channels. But I would ask this: some of the questions about supplies being available. I kind of got the impression from our testimony that Project BioShield, which you urged us to put money into, we put, say, in 18 and 735 and 15 and 19, was supposed to take care of some of that. Am I misunderstanding Project BioShield?
Project BioShield is used to invest in late-stage development of drugs and vaccines
For the drugs.
primarily and some diagnostics.
And they didn't help on this at all.
Didn't help on this.
All right. Now, that being said, and I did say, and I would hope that we would have had everything available to us, and I understand that may not be your fault to create issues, but everything's going crazy. People have all kinds of things going on. And this Hunter Corcoran comes up, and there's some email exhibit 54 from your documents indicate that Chris Christopher Houchins writes, and he says, you know, you should probably take a look at this. I'm paraphrasing, but the line I took out of it was, especially when we have few or no options. One of the frustrations I have had for years with our community trying to respond to all kinds of different diseases is we want to have the double-blind studies in place. We want to have all the science there, which makes sense if you have an alternative. But when you have few or no options, it seems to me you would go after those things that are available. And if hydrochloroquine is one at one point, remdesivir, I'm assuming, have they done the double-blind studies related to COVID on remdesivir? Has that already happened? And then I've got an article from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, April 15th, where a doctor used high doses of vitamin C and a drug called Actera, also an Acterma. All of these are floating out there. Doctors are using all kinds of things because we don't have other options. What was the great hesitancy to at least let doctors try, and even if anecdotally it was having some effect, wouldn't you have to have that available to be able to do the tests? And if you've got few or no options, why wouldn't you want to go down that pathway?
Make sure that the drugs that we consider are safe and effective. Highest priority. So many of these studies that we have are anecdotal reports we had did not include a thorough safety vetting of those drugs. There are some known side effects with some of the drugs. Many of these drugs were repurposed, so they weren't built de novo. So we knew about some of those potential safety concerns, and we didn't have any evidence of how those safety concerns would appear in people infected with virus. This virus takes over a lot of your body and actually affects multiple organs in your body, causing significant inflammation and multi-organ shutdown in some cases before death. And acute respiratory distress syndrome that really turns your lungs into a brick.
It's scary stuff. And you said though on hydrochloroquine that one of the problems was you might have a heart irregular heartbeat. If you're worried about not having a heartbeat at all, that's really not worried about irregular if you don't have one at all. Think about that. And that's the concern. People were dying out there, and here was the first one that showed some promise. Why wouldn't we want to accept, offer from the manufacturer to give us a lot of this and have it out there, widespread use? If the doctors chose, just like the doctor in Richmond, that didn't work in that case. They actually used it in that case. So we tried something else. I mean, I think that's really what we're going to have to do in an emergency situation. Am I not correct?
We need to do it carefully, sir. We have to make sure that when we have that information available with those potential drugs available, we are thinking outside the box.
Can't we be so careful that we actually accidentally kill people?
We need to move swiftly, sir, and to show that we can put up a clinical study in a matter of less than a week. It's important to use the available clinical data. And if we know there are potential risks, we need to make sure we're cognizant of those risks and make sure those drugs are used in a very safe and controlled manner.
I appreciate that. And let me just say this. It's our job to ask some tough questions, but just like you found friendly ears in the White House, you might have found some friendly ears on our side of the aisle here as well. And I would note that in 2018, you were vaccines and you were talking about offshore production. And I said, let me know what I can do. Happy to help. I'm with you on a lot of these issues. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We've got to investigate that. Today, unfortunately, was not the day to do that investigation information. A lot of stuff is not here for us, but don't hesitate in the future. If you see something, let us know on both sides of the aisle.
Right now, you
Appreciate it.
Gentleman on back, to recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Matsui, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Wright, for appearing for us today, and thank you for your public service. Dr. Wright, you described a series of missed opportunities our country woefully unprepared for the pandemic's impact. Many Americans are eager to return to normalcy, as we can all understand, but to even begin, we need widespread testing capacity, an organized contract tracing workforce, and a healthcare system that can handle the surge. And ultimately, a therapeutic cure is required. I'd like to ask you a series of questions about your warnings to the administration while at work. And succinct answer whether you believe each scenario will ultimately shorten or lengthen the time it takes our country to safely reopen, recover from the coronavirus pandemic. On January 10th, we began pushing HHS leadership to obtain sequencing of virus samples. Given the importance of these samples for vaccine and diagnostic development, has the administration's inaction shortened or lengthened a timeline for reopening?
Countermeasures are critical.
Throughout the January, you made HHS aware of the urgent need to use funding to combat the virus. HHS leadership's largest budget was sufficient. Has the delay of these resources shortened or lengthened our timeline for reopening?
Drugs available and vaccines, therefore, has extended our ability to respond to this pandemic.
On January 18th, Dr. Cadillac to coordinate COVID-19 planning activities across the government. Dr. Cadillac initially rejected your request, suggesting it was not time to. Did this delay in coordination shorten or lengthen our timeline for reopening?
The lengthening timeline for reopening, we needed this policy discussion as soon as possible.
From January through March, you pushed for HHS to ramp up production of N95 masks, swabs, and syringes. Has failed to act quickly. Has this inaction shortened or lengthened our timeline to reopen?
Healthcare work. No time to reopen our country will bring those people back to us.
So we can safely reopen. From what I'm hearing today, HHS, they heeded your warnings earlier. The Trump administration prioritized political calculations above public health with regard and hydrochloroquine. Despite the lack of data supporting the clinical benefits of the treatment and prevention of COVID-19, the Trump administration promoted the drug's use to the American people because it was seen as a big immediate win. Dr. Bright, do you believe there are other reasons where the administration relied on politics rather than science to make coronavirus response decisions? And what consequences might those decisions have?
We have a very rigorous scientific review process for all of the investments that we make for the drugs, vaccines, and diagnostics through BARDA and through BARDA. Actually. So there were some attempts to bypass that rigorous vetting process that caused me great concern and actually increased attention to Dr. Cadillac. Without that scientific vetting, it does increase the risk of a drug being evaluated or supported. We have safety concerns. We really needed to have the best scientists in our country weigh in on whether or not that drug should be evaluated and how it should be evaluated to address those safety concerns.
The Trump administration waited until April to invoke the Defense Production Act to production life-saving medical supplies like masks, months after doctors began experiencing shortages, and 3 months after the initial January warnings. HHS have invoked the Defense Act earlier to increase the domestic production of critical medical supplies like masks and swabs.
I'm not an expert on the Defense Production Act and how it's used most effectively. I do believe that we should have been doing everything possible, placing orders early, enough supply, ramping up production of those critical medical equipment as quickly as possible, whether or not that's through the Defense Production Act or other mechanisms. It should have been working.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bright. I'm running out of time. Thank you very much for coming for us.
Gentlewoman yields back. A pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bill Rockets. The floor is 5 minutes.
I appreciate it very much, and I want to thank Dr. Bright as well for their service to our country. I have a few questions, and I'm focusing on the hydroxychloroquine. When was the potential use of chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, as treatment for the COVID-19 first brought to your attention, sir?
I believe it is mid-March, between March 17th, somewhere like that.
Not prior to that.
Not that I recall. The first I heard of it, asking if I'd heard of the drug, and I hadn't heard of the drug, and I hadn't heard of its potential use. That's the first I learned of it.
So you weren't aware of any news articles and research papers in January discussing the potential benefits?
I heard anecdotal stories and reports.
You had?
I had Probably, I can't recall if I did one as well. However, I rely on the guidance of the science within HHS. And the first I've heard of that was my colleague, Dr. Woodcock at the FDA. And then a summary report from our scientists at FDA, CDC, NIH, and BARDA that indicated evidence for its benefit was weak, and the evidence for its safety concern.
And now, again, what was your reaction personally? Did you think it was something worth pursuing initially when you heard from Dr.?
Initially, I said it, I do believe it. I mean, I trust Dr. Woodcock and her scientific judgment immensely. And if she mentioned the team reviewing that protocol and then see if it should be used.
So, I understand, I've heard from experts, and I'm certainly not an expert in this area, that the drug, the one that we're talking about, in this case, hydroxychloroquine, if it's used, first of all, timely, because I now understand there's a window there as far as the patient, the efficacy of the drug. Have you heard this, that if it's administered properly, there's a small window there for the patient as far as risk is concerned? Can you elaborate a little bit on that if you've heard that? And again, this is not from a person, this is from an expert.
We have seen heard anecdotal data from use of this drug in combination with antibiotic azithromycin or combination with or other vitamin C or other things, that there was never sufficient evidence from children. That is why the NIH and probably 40 other institutions around the world are conducting randomized controlled clinical studies with the benefit either treatment or early stage treatment. Most of the data coming out from those clinical studies to date haven't shown an overwhelming level of evidence that they have benefits in those patients. Doesn't mean that it might still have some benefit in individuals or at K2 different studies or that physicians believe that we haven't seen an overwhelming level of benefit.
Have you released, are you, I just want to know, because my constituents ask these questions, do you take those studies into consideration when you make these decisions?
We absolutely do. We look at the quality of those studies. We understand, look to see if they were done with the right controls in place. And science, was it statistically relevant, or was it just a few people, or was it 20 people, or was it 2,000 people? All that adds to the power of the data itself. Many of the studies that we saw early only included a few number of patients, so it was unclear, even from the description of some of those studies that were run in peer-reviewed journals, whether all the patients were treated the same, whether they had full participation throughout the clinical study itself, and whether the VA hospital conducted with hydroxychloroquine that showed that people who were treated with hydroxychloroquine appeared to have a higher rate of death than people who are not treated with hydroxychloroquine. So that study too has weaknesses. No study is actually perfect. You take all of that evidence into account when you make a decision on how to further study the drug or how to use that drug.
It's my understanding that not my constituent, but a U.S. a veteran was cured. Again, this is just what I heard from the drug. That was age. But I've also heard of early stage cases as well. So
Pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Wright, thank you for speaking out loud. I read your whistleblower filing, and I want to ask you about the N95 respirators. These respirators are a small protective equipment. They're not the cloth mask or surgical mask that everyday Americans are encouraged to use, necessary to protect the lives of nurses, doctors, MTs, and those on the front line.
Yes, they're required essential personal protective equipment to protect those frontline healthcare workers from getting infected.
And this is not a hypothetical concern. Just last week, the LA Times reported a tragic story about a heroic nurse, Celia Marcos, who appears to have died because she had an N95 respirator when she rushed into a hospital room to try to save a COVID-19 patient who had stopped breathing. And the nurse is not the only one. According to another report, over 700 staff at just one Detroit area health system have tested positive for COVID-19, and the CDC reported over a month ago that over 9,000 healthcare workers had already contracted COVID and dozens have died. And I checked with my Tampa Bay area health providers, and one Tampa hospital said N95s are still very difficult to procure, and there's a dire need for N95s. One of my community health centers says we continue to struggle to get N95s. There's so many folks trying to sell them. And then a large Tampa Bay area health system said the supply chain remains inconsistent and irregular, and Baker remains concerned as we head into the fall for N95 masks. The demand will continue to increase due to the flu season and the continued presence of COVID-19. Dr. Wright, you understood that America would face a shortage of respirators in January. Is that right?
We understood that America would face a shortage of N95 respirators for pandemic response in 2007. And we have exercised and known and evaluated that number almost every year since 2007. It was exercised even as early as 2019, August, in Crimson Contagion, that we would need 3 billion N95 respirators in our stockpile to protect our healthcare workers from pandemic response.
And you sounded the alarm repeatedly, but were ignored by the senior leadership at the Department of Health and Human Services. Please explain what steps you took and the response you received.
We knew going into this pandemic that critical medical equipment would be in short supply. I began getting alerts from the industry view that the supply chain was diminishing rapidly. That other countries that we relied on to supply many of these masks were blocking export and stopping transfer of those masks to the United States. I learned that China was trying to buy the equipment from the United States producers to have it shipped to China so they could make more. In each of these alerts, and there were dozens of warnings to our critical infrastructure team, I pushed those warnings to our strategic national stockpile team, who has the responsibility of procuring those medical supplies for our stockpile. Because I was met with indifference, saying they were either too busy, they didn't have a plan, they didn't know who was responsible for procuring. In some cases, they had a sick child and they would get back to it later in the week. A number of excuses, but never. It was weeks after my pushing that finally a survey was sent out to manufacturers or producers of those masks, a 5-page survey asking producers or companies if they actually made those masks.
In your whistleblower filing, you discussed the February 7th meeting of the department leadership group, at which you urged the department to focus on securing N95 masks, and you described what happened at that meeting.
They informed me that they did not believe there was an urgency to procure masks. They conducted some surveys, talked to a few hospitals and some companies, and they didn't yet see a critical shortage. And I said that we know there will be a critical shortage of these supplies. We need to do something to ramp up production. They indicated if we notice there is a shortage that we will change the CDC guidelines to better inform people who should not be wearing those masks, so that would save those masks for our healthcare workers. My response was, I cannot believe you can sit and say that with a straight face. That was absurd.
In fact, it took 3 months from your until mid-April for the federal government to invoke its authority under the Defense Production Act. Then, the administration required the production of only 39 million masks. What was the consequence of this 3-month delay in inadequacy?
And not only that, we were forced to procure supplies from other countries without the right quality standards. So even our doctors today are wearing 95 marked masks from other countries that are not providing the sufficient protection
Wow.
that a U.S. standard N95 mask would provide them. Those masks are only 30% effective. Therefore, nurses are protected, and they're not.
Thank you for your,
Gentlewoman's time has expired. A pleasure to recognize
None of this
our
is
colleague
long
from
enough.
Indiana, Dr. Bouchon, for his guidance.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Dr. Wright, for serving in healthcare for over 30-some years. So I want to comment on, I'm not going to ask a question about hydroxychloroquine. I just want to comment on how the medical community responds to this type of thing. Doctors across the country will use drugs often in a circumstance where they don't have or they don't see a viable alternative to that. And I think this is one of those circumstances. I'm hearing from doctors in the country. And look, I'm with you. You have to have double-blind studies. You have to have proof and under normal circumstances. In this situation, a little bit of understanding and leeway from the federal government is in order. We do want to ensure the safety. This is the appropriate doses. It does prolong the QT interval, as you've outlined, which can lead to cardiac arrhythmias if not used properly. But I mean, to tell you, when states tried to stop doctors from using this, there was such a backlash, they had to back away from it because the physicians in the community wanted to use it. And so doctors like me out in the real world, if things are working, and so doctors like me out in the real world, if things are working, they're not going to wait for the government bureaucracy to approve it.
Yes, they are.
I just want to get that on the record. Saying this is why doctors are using this drug. Whether it's right or not, data will show. But you know, if 2 years from now we have the studies and the government stopped that from being used, if I was a family of a person that was stopped from getting hydroxychloroquine, I'd be pretty mad. What about the supply as it relates to PPE, the personal protective equipment? And I think there's enough blame to go around in the federal government about what happened there. You know, after H1N1, where our national stockpiles were depleted, we didn't replenish them. We've had people on both sides of the aisle talking about this, and I found, but you know, I don't want to be accusatory, but I do want to go over some of the facts about BARDA. 15, the Obama administration, a company now known as O&M Halyard, H-A-L-Y-A-R-D, announced a project to develop rapid pandemic mask production. According to federal contract, in 2017, HHS signed off on a $3.3 million with an M payment to Halyard to build a. However, in September 2018, CM budget, the Washington Post reported there wasn't money to pay for the project. Why was the project scrapped, and did you sign off on that decision?
So that project and how you actually pay pastors you described actually. Actually, the technical team must have reviewed that proposal on the next step investment in that machine. I believe that the investment was made to design the machine, build the.
September 2018, were you the head of BARDA?
In 2018, I was the director of BARDA.
Right. So did you sign off on the decision? Because I would expect a decision, contract, money was allocated apparently from HHS to BARDA to do this. I wouldn't expect that to be the director of BARDA signing off on it. So did you sign off on it? So yes or no?
Not necessarily scrap the project, sir. I don't know what the proposal was, and we rely on a very thorough vetting by our contracting office. So that proposal to further continue that project never made it to me. So if it wasn't approved, it didn't mean that project was not brought to me.
Okay, I find that surprising, but I'll take your word for it. Nicole Lurie, who hired you, told the Washington Post that the Halyard contract is part of the explicit strategy to ensure we could surge mask next crisis. Well, now we're here and we don't have it. So we're dealing with the consequences of that decision. And in addition, I guess, to the Halyard, I keep saying that wrong. It is my understanding, well, I'm running out of time. So what I'm going to just say is, look, to doctors across America, you know, it's easy for us to sit in Washington, D.C., whether we're members of Congress or whether we're agencies, and talk in the abstract about people dying in intensive care units, but when you're the physician at the bedside and there is a medication that has promise, and that has a safety profile that we understand, doctors will use it off, offline, and that's what's happening. And
Okay.
whether that's right or
What are you
wrong, we might
talking
take us
about?
to prove. But in the meantime,
Not while we're here.
people can die. So I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired.
And since this was recorded, another
Recognize,
80,000
the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Gray, welcome to this committee. The United States government deploys millions of dedicated public servants working together to achieve our shared goals as a nation, to promote effective government and to protect the public interest, in this instance, to protect the public health. As a scientist and public health official, that was your charge, and you took it seriously. Unfortunately, the record shows that your superiors at HHS and potentially beyond, instead of valuing your expertise and experience, squandered it in ways that in this moment, this crisis, amount to gross negligence. They ignored your science-based pleas to pursue critical strategies, for example, your repeated calls to obtain vials from China and to find supplies, masks, respirators, swabs. They dismissed your science-based warnings about pursuing unproven strategies. They dismissed your concern, for example, about the stampeding towards hydroxychloroquine. We've heard about that today. And they sent you on errant missions and treatments with little therapeutic value, all for the sake of satisfying political cronies. You've testified about there is every reason to believe that if that input had been heeded, similarly, your pleas for action in the early days of the pandemic, it might have saved thousands of lives. I want to thank you for coming forward. I want to thank you for blowing the whistle on this chaotic response to this pandemic. I am sure there are specific conversations, emails, moments in time that you remember like they happened yesterday, inflection points where if the response to your warnings had been heeded, things might have been different. And I'm sure they haunt you and keep you up at night. In January this year, tell me about just one specific moment when you had that sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach because you were not seeing the response that you knew needed to happen.
Congressman, I'll never forget the email I received from Mike Bowen and indicating that we're mass supply or N95 respirator supply was completely decimated. And he said, we're in deep shit. The world is. We need to act. And I pushed that forward to the highest levels I could in HHS, got no response. From that moment, I knew we were going to have a crisis for our healthcare workers taking action. We were already behind the ball. That was our last window of opportunity to turn on action and save the lives of those healthcare workers. We did that.
Listening to your testimony gives me chills because it all adds up to one inescapable conclusion. It didn't have to be this way. There was another path. Things could have gone differently. The federal response to the pandemic could have been much more effective. So here we are, at a moment when our country needs the kind of expertise and science-based guidance that you and others like you can offer us. These voices are too often being sidelined. Things are upside down. In you, we have someone who made the right call in the early days and has been removed from your position, while so many people who made the wrong call still have their jobs. When the counsel that you and others offer is cast aside, I know you know this, it means that science and reason are also cast aside. That's a dangerous impulse. It's an attitude that deprives our country in this critical moment of any chance of getting ahead of this pandemic. But hopefully we can learn from this. There's still time to put science and reason back in the national strategy for fighting COVID-19. We need people like you to help lead us through this. The federal response has got to get smarter. It has to put science ahead of politics and crime and wish that to tell us what can we do now to learn from the mistakes of January, February, and March. may navigate and lead our country through this public health crisis.
All right, but we need to empower leaders. We need to unleash the voices of the scientists in our public health system in the United States so they can be heard. Those need to be listened to, and we need to be able to convey that information to the American public. They have the truth, risk, and dire consequences of this virus. And they have the truth about the consequences of their actions if they don't follow those. And we don't have a single point leadership right now for this response. And we don't have a master plan for this response. Those two things are absolutely critical. I would also encourage Congress to ensure there is oversight of this response. Large sums of funding have become available to help us, the scientists and others, resist this outbreak. And without proper oversight of those dollars, I'm concerned that they could be misdirected and lost, and not put to the right fight. So I would urge
Yeah.
Congress to
It's already
continue
been
and
done.
increase the oversight and how those funds are being ensured they're prioritized and used appropriately in this pandemic.
Thanks for that caution. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired and he yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Brooks. 5 minutes for her question.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. With all due respect, Vice President was named the head of the coronavirus White House Task Force, which was actually a recommendation from bipartisan Blue Ribbon Study panel that issued recommendations years ago and thought the office of the Vice President ought to be in charge of the response. And so, with all due, I believe there is that coordination. And part of what I'm very, very concerned relative to this hearing is that there's the impression being made that there's been no plan. And in fact, that's part of what the authorization of PAPA, that I worked closely with you, Dr. Cadlick, the Congressman Eshie, Dr. Burgess, so many of us relied on you all to share with us what we needed to do to reauthorize PAPA, which most members of Congress really didn't know what that was, in the Hazard Preparedness Act. Most members of Congress and most members of the American public didn't know we had strategic national stockpiles and that we might actually short some of these things until this all hit. But we did get that reauthorized. And Dr. Bright, you joined BARDA to lead the influenza division in 2010, right after H1N1, because of your expertise. And we were expertise, and you became director in 2016. After, and you mentioned it in 2007, but after the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, the supply of masks in the strategic national stockpile was not resupplied. You've mentioned that actually you've had problems since 2007. So to share with you, members like Congresswoman Eshie and I had discussions about this. Many really didn't know that. As members of this committee, did not know and were not told of these shortages of masks as we worked through of this important law. Were you aware of this issue, and did you push HHS to maintain mask production for purposes of replenishing the strategic stockpile before this happened in January?
Before 2017, we actually held an annual review of the strategic stockpile that was chaired by Dr. Laurie, the previous ASPR. Since we moved the strategic national stockpile from the CDC management under the ASPR management, we have not yet had an interagency cross-departmental review of the supplies in that strategic national stockpile. We went through an annual prioritization process. There's always been limited funding, never enough to completely top off the stockpile.
Did you know Greg Burrell? He retired prior to all of this happening. He led the strategic national stockpiles. Did you have conversations with Greg Burrell and stockpile?
Absolutely. The Flu Risk Management meeting met on a monthly, and each year they reviewed and prioritized items that should be purchased by the Strategic National Stockpile. That body, which I actually directed for some time, made recommendations and prioritizations to the Strategic National Stockpile. However, it was the Strategic National Stockpile's responsibility to make those purchases.
And how time is limited to explain what FEMC is. This is a plan. Experts like yourself, there have been plans. There have been plans that FEMC had forth 2017-18 implementation plan. The White House put forth in September of 2018 a National Biodefense Plan. Participate in that National Biodefense Plan?
I did. Many of us did.
And it was the first time that our country had actually put forth a National Biodefense Plan. And he said it was kind of landmark. And same thing with FEMC putting forth many plans. So I want the American people to know a lot of we did not still have enough. We didn't have enough swabs. We didn't have enough masks. We don't have enough for all of those incredible health providers. So I don't want everyone to be getting the impression that you raised the flag just in January, okay, when you saw it, because you hadn't gotten the job done prior to January. You were at those tables, as were so many others. This happened over a very and was not in the Strategic National Stockpile. I thank you for your service. I thank you for your expertise. Across the board, over many administrations, we did not do enough. And I
You want to respond, Doctor?
I could say that those put in place, and it's disappointing they were not pulled out in January this year and followed. They were not put on the table with a strong leader indicating our plans, everyone fall in line and follow through with this plan. I think it's important to emphasize the FEMC is the Public Health Emergency Medical Countermeasure, which comprised many great scientists from across our government who put these plans in place. But since 2017, we have largely dismantled the FEMC organization. We have not had those interagency discussions for a number of years, 1 or 2 meetings at most, in the new restructured or reorganized FEMC organization. So the partners and colleagues haven't had those interviews to even talk or coordinate for another meeting.
The gentlewoman's time has expired and she's yielded back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan. Your 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Bright, you described pressure senior hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID-19 despite the lack of scientific treatment through the Strategic National Stockpile. On March 17, your team of experts at HHS, quote, accepting the donation could lead to widespread use that is not supported by any clinical data. Further, one of the public health experts advising you said, quote, no data available to support that chloroquine provides clinical benefit to the treatment or prevention of COVID-19, close quote. Yes or no, Dr. Bright, are there safety liabilities associated with chloroquine?
There are.
According to your whistleblower complaint at the time of the Bayer office, BARDA and FDA scientists was that it was advisable to wait for additional clinical data before making any recommendations on the use of chloroquine to treat COVID-19. Is that correct, yes or no? Yet on March 19th, Bayer moved forward and announced the donation of chloroquine. And President Trump told the country at a press conference that the drug had, quote, shown very, very encouraging early results, close quote. Yes or no, was the president's statement accurate?
I do not think that was the best informed statement.
That press conference don't know that plan. It's not going to kill anybody, close quote. Yes or no, is that statement accurate?
The drug had been around a long time for its use in COVID-19 patients.
And malaria says that.
In days of that press conference, you received urgent instructions from HHS General Counsel, passed from the White House, directing you to obtain the authorization to make the drugs widely available to the public.
That's true.
Yes or no? Did the pressure from the White House and HHS General Counsel put you in a difficult position?
We had to come up with the alternate solution that our administration would accept.
Yes or no? Did the administration resist this compromise?
I eventually the emergency use authorization option was accepted by Dr.
That's
Kazan.
great.
What I'm aware of, and I would agree with that, that the H Assistant Secretary, Health Admiral Brett Goyer, April 4 said this compromise, quote, matters not, close quote, and that the drugs to go to pharmacies as well as hospitals. Dr. Wright, there are only 24 hours in a day. And every hour you and your team have to spend on chloroquine is an hour you couldn't work on fighting team from your mission of saving lives.
The directive we received the practical scientists who were focused on the coronavirus, they had to set aside all other work to try to put together this protocol in a 48-hour directive.
Yes or no, did it distract from effort supplies?
To distract from their efforts in developing other vaccines that they were focused on at that time. It's a different group of individuals who were focused on procuring PPE.
Dr. Bright, just yesterday, the president questioned the testimony of Dr. Fauci when discussing children and schools. The president insisted that, quote, it has very, very impact on young people. Dr. Bright, yes or no, do we know that the president's statement is accurate?
There's a lot we don't yet know about this virus and its of the impact of this virus in children. It's proceed very cautiously and not any hope or knowledge that we know everything about this virus.
Dr. Bright, I want to end by quoting your testimony, quote, without clear planning and implementation of steps that I and other experts have outlined, 2020 will be the darkest winter in modern history. The darkest winter in modern history. Yes or no, do you believe the ministry, and what more should they be doing?
That's scary.
I believe there's a lot of, we need still a comprehensive plan, and everyone across the government, critical steps that we need to do to prepare for that fall, for that winter coming. We do not still have enough personal protective equipment to manage our healthcare workers from influenza and COVID-19. We still do not have the supply chains ramped up for the drugs and vaccines. So we still don't have plans in place how we distribute those drugs and vaccines. We still do not have a comprehensive testing strategy so Americans know which tests do what to do with that information, virus, and trap it. There's a lot of work we still have to do.
Gentlemen, yield back. A pleasure to recognize the gentleman questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd be remiss not to thank you for your continued prayers for my son. It's very kind. I really appreciate it. Dr. Bright, you're here on your own time as an individual, is that correct?
Yes.
Where are you currently employed?
I'm currently an employee of the Department of Health and Human Services, and I'm in the middle of transition, I guess you'd say, between BARDA and the NIH.
So you accepted the reassigned position to NIH?
Except that this position is under discussion at this point. I have not yet accepted that role.
Are you currently being paid?
I'm currently being paid.
Were you being paid?
I believe it's out of.
Is that correct?
I've received one paycheck, sir.
Right.
Yeah. I think it was still part BARDA and part NIH. I've had discussions about my onboarding process with NIH.
Are you, at BARDA, you make $25?
I don't think my salary has changed.
It's still the same? So you've been over there for approximately 4 weeks, a month?
It has been about 3 weeks since I was removed from my office at BARDA.
So have you reported to NIH yet?
Process, and we had a call just last evening to discuss the framework of responsibilities that they have envisioned for me at the NIH.
So you haven't actually reported work, but you're still getting paid, correct?
I've been on sick leave since out of my position at BARDA.
For what?
For a very high blood pressure, and I've been under treatment for my position.
For hypertension?
For hypertension, from that medical leave to annual leave, so I can manage this.
What is annual leave?
I have informed them about status, and I've had a conversation with them last night.
So you transferred from medical leave to vacation this week, or to start next week?
What?
I had a conversation
The entire time talking about
hypertension,
this.
how we've been managing it over the last 3 weeks, because this has been very
Damn.
stressful to be removed suddenly without explanation for my role. It's a life change for me. The physician is working very closely with me to manage my hypertension and stress. And the conversation I had last night indicated.
I guess I'm kind of confused there, because you say you have hypertension, but yet you're too sick to go into work, but you're well enough to come here while you're still being paid from the United States government. Right?
Yes, that's correct.
Sir, I've been under medical leave until.
I get that, but if you've been underneath medical leave, too sick to do that, but yet you can prepare for a 2-hour hearing. I'm just having a hard time tracking that. I have a NIH, but yet you didn't have that in BARDA, right? You never had issues in BARDA with
I didn't have
hypertension.
the level of stress of being removed from my position while I was in BARDA. So
People handle pressure. People handle pressure quite different. But as a director of BARDA, I feel like you're quite a bit. You can manage that, but yet you can still receive pay from NIH, but you can't show up for work, and then all of a sudden you can prepare for this, but you can't do that. I just have a hard. I know you're a bright individual and very smart, but you are an employee of the federal government. I just want to make sure you're not doing something to deceive the American people at the same time getting paid from the United States government. But that I'm going to yield to a ranking member Walden.
I thank the gentleman. The lawyer appears to have a pretty substantial binder there. And I know Mr. Guthrie asked about the documents that are on the table. Are those the exhibits to your complaint to the Office of Counsel?
I don't know what my.
I'll direct it to the council then, since she's answered the other question. Are those the exhibits to the complaint, the Office of Special Counsel?
Some are, and some are my work product, and some of my notes are not appropriate to turn over to Congress.
So is it appropriate to turn over the documents that are referenced in the complaint, not your work product, to this committee? Would you do that?
You asked that question initially, and I said we would look at the documents and determine whether they are appropriate or not.
I'm just talking about the ones that we have partial email chains, we have screenshots of emails. I think we should have the right to see those documents if we really know the full extent of this complaint. And I just wish you would commit to turn those over. Dr. Bright, will you turn those over?
I think I addressed that.
I'm asking Dr. Bright now.
I've
You willing
submitted
to
my
turn
full
over?
complaint to the Office of Special Counsel, and that is the process I know to follow. So,
But you're here as the
Gentleman's time is expired.
whistleblower. We just want to see what you've submitted so we can evaluate it ourselves.
Special Counsel, which I've done so. I don't understand the legalities of others sharing that before they've had their opportunity to review that. And
They've certainly been shared into the public and press.
Well, then go read it.
From some source. They look a lot like what's referenced in your complaint. None of us, I don't know where those came from, but that's certainly seen. I think as part of this investigation, Madam Chair, you should request them.
We will seek all information that's appropriate to be submitted to the committee. And what I circulated, or recirculated, to all members of the subcommittee, emails that were public, as well as the complaint. That's as well. I mean, Politico has something too. I don't know the veracity.
But in any other investigation, we'd both be going.
I think we need to move on. The gentleman in Oregon is recognized, Mr. Schrader.
Thank you for being here, Dr. I really appreciate it. Tough to do. Very impressive that you're here. Could you describe the tone and reactions of Dr. Kaddick and Dr. Azar at your January 23rd meeting? And they had the all agencies meeting on COVID. Could you describe how up to speed they seem to be?
in that meeting, sir, it was one of our first meetings that we had about to have to address the outbreak. Because we practiced, I came in with my list of needs, and those lists were money, people, and viruses. My request was met with a bit of surprise and puzzlement. I remember Secretary Azar looking around the room and saying, money, maybe there's money somewhere. I mean, it was just something I just don't
despite the fact that we had the outbreak in China for some time.
January 23rd at this point.
You describe January 25th, if you remember, email exchange with
specific, but I'm sure it was urgent. I'm sure that Mr. Bowen was sending me a notice saying, asking.
You didn't ask him to come and talk to you. He just reached out to you.
Yes, sir. Okay.
About an email exchange occur on January 27th. you reach out to Dr. Hurd, he'd come and ask.
Dr. Kerr reached out to me, I believe. This was because, again, he is a pandemic influenza expert as well, response, and he knows the vital nature of meeting those viruses. And he was involved in prepping our secretary. All you have with the vice minister of Ma in China. And we knew a high priority was for our secretary to ask for those viruses. We had challenges in the viruses in China from avian influenza strains and viruses. So this was a high priority because we needed that to get started. And he indicating that the CDC director had reprioritized and actually indicated we did not need, or he did not need to, the secretary did not need China for viruses. It was alarming to us because we knew how critical it was.
That sounds incredible in light of what has transpired since then. So my major point here is that we have a brave individual coming forward as a whistleblower, but he is not alone. There are many others, experts, scientists, and manufacturers that realized we were in, if I may say, deep shit, not a long time ago, long before the administration. What do you think would have happened if Mr. Navarro had not reached out to you and actually responded to you? Where would we be now?
It's difficult to speculate where we were. So even when Mr. Navarro reached and strongly suggested action be taken on February 10th, February 9th is an email, February 10th, it was conveyed to Dr. Cadler that we needed to ramp up production of N95 masks. That order did not go out. That solicitation not closed till March 18th. Even throughout this outbreak.
Yeah, well, it's been hard to get folks' attention here in Washington, D.C. and the administration. And I'm a little concerned we're going too much the other way in terms of information. You alluded to here on the vaccines, or under the impression there's a vaccine going to be developed in a couple of months and everything's going to be fine. I go back to work. And we unfortunately have to juxtapose the indicator, but it can take up to 10 years. And tough question to ask. I suppose you don't have to answer it. To be, I don't want America to think they can just not get back to some semblance of a new post-COVID life until a vaccine, because that could take years. And there's a chance the vaccine will maybe not be as effective, much like our flu vaccines that the flu mutates sometimes. So I just want to make sure that you would ask you if you would agree that we can't wait to open up America entirely until a vaccine is there. We have to move around as you've already said.
We have to make sure that we have some scientifically led on how and when it's safe to reopen America. If it happens before we have a vaccine, if we have a vaccine faster, that's great, but we do need to open America up sooner. We need to make sure everyone understands and knows their activities, and everyone has to play a critical part in following those activities to reduce the risk. We have to have a test base and enough tests to make sure that we know when people are exposed, so they can be quarantined and isolated and not continue to infect others. We also are developing a number of therapies that could offer some potential benefit prophylactically or protect you almost like a vaccine before you're infected. And those are being developed even faster than them. And if healthcare workers and frontline workers can use those therapeutics, that might offer them some protection as well. I believe if we let science lead the discussion, and we inform America of the risk and the clear guidance on what needs to happen, follow that guidance. There are stepwise process to getting back to work and back out of our homes. Thank you very much.
Time has expired. And he yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe any whistleblower should be respected and allowed to be heard. As a core component of keeping it's about ownership its work. To disregard the minority so spectacularly in the organization of this hearing only highlights the partisan and political nature of this hearing. I hope the day will be held up in the future as a lesson of what not to do, the respect and gravity that should be given to whistleblower complaints so that they're not abused for expediency. More importantly, though, we have vital work we should be doing. My constituents want Congress to get back to work. I'm glad to be here to highlight the important work that I heard from an ophthalmologist in my district this week about the need for relief. She says she'll consider this year a success if her practice group
even breaks even. We should be examining the $175 billion authorized and appropriated in a bipartisan manner for providers, what providers still need, and recommendations for moving forward. We should also be examining why there are gaps in outcomes, access for minority communities. Fayetteville, North Carolina, in my district, has a large and diverse community. And understandably, the folks back because coronavirus hits them hardest. Why are we not spending our time today examining this crisis within a crisis? Done extraordinary things to secure more PPE. I want to thank President Donald Trump for his strong leadership. Not only did his administration quickly to coordinate a response, but his travel ban on January 30th. The administration has gone to great lengths to an adequate system they inherited. As you testified earlier, move quickly to start programs like Project Airbridge, expedite more PPE coming in. The questions remain about why there's a shortage and what more Congress can do to support the administration's efforts to secure sufficient PPE. This committee should be working on that question. We have multiple pieces of legislation waiting to be considered to improve the operations of the strategic national stockpile. We should be examining why our stockpile was allowed to dwindle under previous administrations. These problems are timely and critical to help this administration combat this virus and the deadly disease causes. I hear from constituents every day that weren't suffering from substance use disorder or mental health challenges before they were confined. And this crisis has exacerbated this problem. Why are we not examining access issues to mental health providers and the effects this crisis has had on our constituents' mental health? Dr. Bright, you're no doubt an accomplished scientist, and I appreciate the service you've rendered the country. You deserve to be heard, and your whistleblower complaint should be given the serious consideration the whistleblower complaint deserves. We also deserve to have the opportunity to ask questions about serious allegations that have been made against you. Again, this is not the time or place for that here. The time is after the Office of Special Counsel has completed its work. The place is the Oversight and Investigations Committee. Dr. Bright, building on questions from Mr. Walden and others, I released an article yesterday stating that your complaint left out a lot of information in Congress regarding agency decisions to acquire hydroxychloroquine. It was not to elevate your concerns to the Office of the Inspector General. It kept selected screenshots. It didn't include full context. For example, the Wall Street Journal reported in a meeting today the Office of the Inspector General.
So the early days of that, when I was aware of the hydroxychloroquine, we were interested in acquiring that drug for its use in a randomized controlled study. Actually, when I heard from Dr. Woodcock that it's something that we should investigate in a randomized controlled study, I even reached out to a company that was licensed and approved to make that drug in the United States, to see if they could the NIH to conduct those clinical studies. I was aware of other efforts that were ongoing to try to acquire some of that drug for its use in randomized studies. As long as it was going to be used at that time for those randomized controlled clinical studies, I thought we should look into the supply chain, the same way I did with remdesivir. It was only after I learned that it was being discussed, it's coming in from Pakistan, from India, facilities that were not appropriated, the drug was not approved for use in the United States, I became increasingly alarmed at having that drug in the United States. Second was when I had the drug and not be under the close supervision of the health, that caused 10 days afterwards that we put in that emergency use authorization with the buffers and barriers that we built under close medical supervision. In the earlier days, in that email exchange that you're referring, was before we knew about this information in Pakistan, before we knew it was going to be used for expanded access protocol. It was when I thought our efforts to obtain some of that drug to be used at the NIH to conduct randomized control clinical studies. Otherwise, we did identify the supplies of that drug for those clinical studies.
My time's expired, Madam Chair. Are you back?
Gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Dr. Bright, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for your service to our country. Let's on this hearing a little bit. As of this morning, which means these numbers have increased, there's nearly 1.4 million cases diagnosed with COVID-19 in the United States and over 80,000 fatalities. Experts believe both of those numbers aren't undercounted because after 5 months of this virus being on our shores, we still have a systemic problem with regards to robust testing. Is that right? Cases in many states across the country are still actually increasing in number despite that lack. You mentioned in your testimony that, quote, we missed early warning signs and forgot important pages from our pandemic playbook. Is that right? I'm sure you've been the head of ours since 2016. Is that right? Until recently. You experienced any pandemics prior to this one over your course of time, either there or in government service?
We responded to the Zika outbreak. We responded to the Ebola outbreak. We didn't rise to the level of pandemic.
Of course. You're aware at the end of the Obama administration, the Obama team put together a playbook to try to guide succeeding administrations in how to handle an outbreak. Right, in January 2017, with an incoming administration cut the number of CDC staff located in 40 and contagion. That was a simulation done by HHS and begun in January of 2019. Can you shine just very briefly a little bit of light as to what the findings were?
The significant findings. It was actually the participants were beyond HHS and covered broad areas of government, federal, state, locals. Significant findings were the need for improved coordination, communication, and alignment between federal, state, local, tribal, territorial governments, and the need for personal protective equipment, and a shortage, and a significant need for funding in your.
And sir, that simulation was based off of a flu-like virus that was initially in China, spread by global air travel, and resulted in the infection of 110 million Americans, leading to 7.7 million hospitalized and nearly 600,000.
Yes.
Sir, are you? When did you first have concerns about the potential impact of COVID-19 on the United States?
In January.
And were you aware that your supervisor, Dr. Cadlick, suggested that the activation of the Defense Production Act?
I wasn't aware of him doing that.
Okay. Well, you mentioned that you had 2 meetings with Secretary Azar. I'm sure you had others, but you referenced so far meetings on January 23rd and 27th, where you raised concerns directly to the Secretary. Is that right?
Yes. The Secretary was not at the second meeting. Deputy Secretary Harvey was there.
You're aware that top National Security Council staff, including National Security Advisor Mr. O'Brien and his deputy Matthew Pottinger, raised significant warnings downplaying the impacts of this virus.
I did learn that in the meeting at the White House, yes.
You're aware that we sent 17.8 tons of medical supplies to China in early February. Are you aware that the Trump administration budget proposal released in February of 2020 called for a cut to CDC by nearly $700 million?
I'm not aware of that. I've heard of it.
You're familiar with a memo written by Peter Navarro that warned of the impact of the virus?
Yes.
Are you aware that it was spread among senior administration?
Yes.
Are you aware that it was honored up to April 2nd when the Trump administration finally activated and expanded the Defense Production Act, months after by you and other senior administration officials?
And I've learned that.
Are you aware that that order itself did not extend to the full authority of the DP, unless a haphazard allocation process to states and hospitals to compete against each other?
I don't know the details of that authority, sir.
Has the coronavirus task force actually developed before reopening the country?
I'm not aware of the full plan to reopen, sir.
They developed some principles that the White House has touted as some principles to reopen, how to reopen the country.
I've heard of some principles.
Are states following that plan?
It doesn't appear that there is a nationwide coordinated plan that states are following, sir.
So after this recitation of the actions and inactions of this administration over the course of the past 6 months or so, can we possibly say that this has prepared our country for the moment that we are in, and how we could possibly be prepared for the distribution, development, manufacturing, and distribution of a vaccine to try to address 330 million Americans over the course of the months ahead?
I think we have a lot of work to do to be prepared, sir.
You're
fully prepared.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Long, for his 5 minutes of questions. Okay. So we're going to. You want to pass? Okay, you can reserve, and we'll go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bright, for being here today, and just want to tell you that my family, my community, and myself, we appreciate your years of focused service, specifically when it comes to addressing pandemic outbreaks. And it's my understanding that you've spent those 5 years leading teams of scientists when it comes to drugs, diagnostics, and vaccine development. We appreciate that. When an administration or decision makers prioritize politics over science, does that tend to increase or decrease the likely results of the loss of life?
I believe the scientists are best equipped to understand how to manage a public health crisis, and I believe scientists should lead.
And therefore, question again, I'll phrase it differently. If the scientists are not leading and the politicians are leading with the final decisions when trying to address issues of pandemic in people's lives, that way of handling it, does it likely increase the loss of life, or is it likely to decrease the loss of life?
I believe the scientists leading will actually increase the likelihood that we can survive this pandemic and move through it. So if scientists are to lead and speak up, I believe it could increase the loss of lives.
Amen.
Thank you. How many times in your career have you personally, actively said, I need to enact my right to be a whistleblower? How many times in 5 years have you decided to enact your right to be a whistleblower?
This is my first time, sir.
Well, I knew that answer was simple, and I think I confused you because I made it so simple. And the reason why I want to say that is because I believe that you've been incredibly consistent in your willingness to dedicate yourself, your expertise, and your career to saving lives. Is the loss of life on your mind? Was that on your mind when you decided that you needed to be a whistleblower?
I've spent my career focused on saving lives, and sir, everything I've done to come forward now is to awareness of challenges we have, things that are not getting done, because I do think it will save more lives.
Are you aware of the fact that the lack of testing in the United States of America is affected by many pieces of the puzzle in order for people to get testing, whether it's swabs, whether it's N95 rated equipment for the caregivers to be able to enact safely with the public? Those all factors that have contributed to our lack of having adequate testing in America?
They are factors, sir. I don't think anyone has through the entire plan completely to understand those critical components for testing. I think there's a lot of confusion. Tests, it's not about the numbers so much as the right types of tests in America.
The high level of the United States government in this space that we're discussing at this moment. So my question is, if implementing, was it the lack of science recommending up the chain of command, or was it the people at the top of the chain of command deciding to do things differently than the scientists strongly recommend?
There's evidence of scientists raising concerns about shortages and other actions that are important to take that were not being taken. Difference in them that I asked for Dr. Pavlin, that I believe is dismissive of the early warnings tonight.
Okay. And you said early warnings, and despite the early warnings, have there been other examples where warnings and strong recommendations were either being?
I believe that I've learned of others. I mean, the CDC has written several guidelines for reopening America and getting people out of their homes and back to work. And I'm not sure if all of those guidelines have been reviewed or are being publicly considered at this point. There's another example.
Things I have no idea how much time I have. The clock's been flipping back and forth. But in fact, to date, we should have had billions gone out throughout America. Isn't that
disparity. It's a huge disparity, and healthcare workers are having to compromise their protection and their health and safety because they're going to be creative and reuse us for the entire week for novel sterilization practices that are not proven and tested yet. So that disparity actually is impacting our frontline workers and the people whose lives are removed and deserve to be treated.
I have family members who are working in hospitals today on the front lines who have been telling me that they are wearing tape and they're having to use it over and over. So the clock, it kept flipping back and forth.
You're absolutely right. It went from up to 121, so I'm looking too. My father was a watchmaker, clock repairman. Where's Daddy when we need him? A pleasure to recognize Mr. Long from Missouri for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, ma'am. And Dr. Bright, you contend that your removal was because the Trump administration and HHH leadership, in particular, lacked scientific. Do you think that Dr. Fauci lacked scientific integrity?
So I don't think my removal is anything associated with Dr. Fauci at all. I think removal was because of tension and actions I took between my advisor and supervisor, Dr. Cadman, and myself.
You know about Dr. Fauci's testimony 2 days before the Senate Health Committee?
I'm aware of that testimony is.
If HHH leadership is so hostile to scientific integrity, as you say, how do you explain Dr. Fauci being allowed to testify forthrightly, to serve in a prominent role in the White House
They
task
have been
force
withheld
administration,
since then.
and direct AIDs,
In the moon, in the White House.
So I'm not sure what decisions are involved in allowing Dr. Fauci to testify or not.
Can you say that again?
I'm not sure. I'm not aware of what process or decisions are involved in allowing Dr. Fauci to testify or not.
He was allowed to testify.
I thought I should be asking if that would work. Around to maybe repeat your question if I misunderstood it.
You're saying HHS is hostile to scientific integrity. If that's the case, can you explain why Dr. Fauci was hostile to? Why would you let him testify without any hold bar?
Ask him.
I'm supervisor was not following proper scientific process that we have in place for BARDA. I'm not actually saying the administration against scientific integrity in all cases. So I'm saying in my particular situation, as in my claim, my supervisor was
Inspector General. Why did you not bring him in the loop?
I believe some of the acts were not isolated with Dr. Cadlick. I think some of his senior staff was also aware of some of the processes that were being utilized to go around additional review process, scientific review process.
What normal protocol in any situation be that you go to Secretary of HHS or his chief of staff or the Inspector General with their concerns instead of just gathering them up and deciding that one day you're going to.
Well, I didn't decide that. I was pushed out, sir, and involuntarily transferred without my
When you
knowledge.
have these concerns, so why don't you take them to your superiors when you have the concerns? And maybe none of this, maybe we wouldn't be here today. It wasn't easy for any of us to be here today.
So I requested an IG investigation that's in my claim, and I think it was in 2018 that they looked into what I believe was inappropriate pressure on some of our contracting activities and discussion about procurement integrity. And I did not think that was ever followed through on. So
Turns to the Inspector General.
I do not believe they were followed up through and submitted to the Inspector General. I raised those concerns to our HHS.
You personally didn't talk to the Inspector General, didn't raise concerns with the Inspector General or with ASAR's chief or with ASAR.
I raised those with the Secretary's Office of General. They were present in that meeting. So.
You state in your testimony that HHH leadership was dismissive about the predictions about the broader outbreak and the pressing. However, it's my understanding it was Dr. Redfield at CDC who alerted the White House's National Security Council about the risk of the virus second.
and a high-level team with the NSC's Counterproliferation and Biodefense Directorate quickly address the possibility of a pandemic. You consider Dr. Redfield's actions here to be dismissive about the threat of the home.
We're aware of the urgency. What was lacking was the action and how to address the urgency. So when we were raising issues on critical supply chain equipment to protect doctors and nurses, if they're aware of the urgency of the situation and still fail to act, because it's even more cautionary aware of the emergency and not acting.
In your new position, I would recommend that you have that you might go to the head of the department to
Yes, guys.
Gentleman yields back. Pleasure to yield
One
to the
more.
gentleman from Vermont.
Thank you very much. Your job, our job, is to protect the American people. And this fierce fire can be managed if done correctly. Correct?
I believe so.
And in fact, the playbook is established. It's
No, it's not.
testing, contact tracing, and then isolation, starting social isolation. Correct?
Yes, non-pharmaceutical interventions and testing are critical steps.
Right. And in fact, this virus is world in many countries that have followed that tried and true protocol have done far better than the US. Is that correct?
We have seen differences in the response in terms of that response around the world.
I'll go through some of those. And the John Hopkins study that said that the US had the best preparedness, it turned out we have the response, correct? In most cases and the most deaths.
We have the most cases and the most deaths.
And I did some calculations. You know, on January 19th, South Korea determined its first case. On January 19th, U.S. determined its first case, correct?
Mm.
And the 20th was the U.S. case.
Right. And if we had the same response as South Korea, they had 33,000 deaths. We would have saved 50,000 lives. In Taiwan, they had the same virus, 22,000, again, adjusting for population, it's 60,000 more deaths we've had here. Singapore, 82,000 more deaths. New Zealand, 65,000. The question for us here, the American people, is why? When we had the best plan, we established one. Beginning in January, that first case here, FDA chief comes to possible storage of equipment. And he got blown out by HHS, correct?
And I understand.
And on January 18th, before our case, we pushed Dr. Kelda to convene high-level meetings about the virus, but that was initially rejected, correct? And then on January 23rd, you gave me medicines. You curing surgical masks. That was ignored, correct? On January 27th, we participated in the daily COVID-19 meeting where you expressed frustration with the slow pace of accessing viral impulse meetings. Is that right?
That's true.
So you and others actually seeing over the horizon what was coming to our shores, even before our first case was confirmed, correct?
We had spent many years in a pandemic, sir, and we understood the threat, we understood what we needed to do.
Exactly. It's knowable and it's manageable. It's fierce, but what you have to do is established. Is that more or less correct?
Yes, sir.
You just didn't do it. February 25th, President gave an assurance that the stock market is starting to look very good and the coronavirus was very much under control. Were you aware of any?
No, sir, I don't think.
Now, in those countries I mentioned, it includes Germany, Taiwan. The leaders of those countries accepted that there was a role only named on them for that. And I want to go through some of those things. One, establishing a testing protocol, and the personal protective equipment to where it was needed, when it was needed. Was that done here?
No, sir.
In fact, we had governors and hospitals competing with each other to try to get desperate equipment. Isn't that correct?
A lot of confusion, a lot of competition, and bad decisions made to acquire poor quality products.
In any of those other countries that I just mentioned, are you aware of the leader of that country press conference making recommendations on what kind of medication people should use?
I don't know the details of what happened in those countries, sir, so I don't know.
We had governors here, Republicans and Democrats, Republicans like Phil Scott from Vermont, who have done a tremendous job. But no matter how good they do their job, can they protect without the aggressive intervention of the federal government playing its role?
I think the federal government plays a critical role in aligning and making an equitable distribution of those critical supplies. I believe that's what we've practiced and exercised in the past, that there would be a critical role for federal coordination at state, local, and tribal territory.
LOL.
Thank you, Dr. Brett. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pleasure to recognize the gentleman, Mr. Carter. Do you wish to question, or do you want to pass? The reserve, okay? Gentleman from Mr. Ruiz is recognized for 5 minutes of questions. Dr. Ruiz.
Thank you, Dr. Bright. Thank you for your testimony here and service to our country. My heart aches for the family and friends of the over 80,000 in America who have died of COVID-19 in a short period of time. In fact, my heart aches for those closer to me. The Riverside County has reported 228 deaths. As a doctor, I appreciate your written testimony that states that science, not politics or cronyism, must lead the way to combat this deadly virus. There's been a lot of hype about cures for COVID that have been shown to be ineffective and even dangerous. We are now seeing the very real dangers and consequences of not decisions based on science. Hydroxychloroquine, which Fox News commentators and then the White House repeatedly touted and actually encouraged people to use, Exhibit A on this list. But there is one drug that appears to provide some therapeutic benefit, remdesivir. 2 weeks ago, Dr. Fauci remdesivir showed a clear-cut, significant positive effect in diminishing the time to recovery. My understanding is that in January and early February, you comprehensive review to assess which existing drugs might prove a therapeutic benefit, and you quickly identified remdesivir as the most likely drug to be effective against COVID-19. Can you describe that conclusion, who you told within HHS, and what the response was?
So that conclusion came about by a technical review from within HHS and the CDC, FDA, NIH, and BARDA. It was also aligned with a scientific assessment from WHO and a number of global experts. They looked at every potential drug and ranked remdesivir as the drug that had the most potential for benefit.
Who did you tell? What was the response?
We share that information with Catholic. We share that information within HHS leadership as well. We had discussions about the actions that could be considered for acquiring to supply remdesivir.
What was your response?
We had discussions about how to ramp up production of more remdesivir in case the randomized controlled clinical study the NIH was conducting came through with positive.
So you had a discussion, and what was the response? Did anything happen?
No decision was made.
Okay. My understanding is that Peter Navarro, the White House trade advisor, reached out to you on February 7th to seek your counsel. You told him about your top 3 concerns: the shortage of N95 masks, the need for a quote-unquote Manhattan Project to develop vaccines, and securing adequate supplies of remdesivir. Can you tell us if Mr. Navarro agreed with you and what steps and he took?
Mr. Navarro did agree with me on the remdesivir, the N95 and the Vaccine Manhattan Project, and he drafted a memo February 9th to the White House Chief of Staff and Mick Mulvaney to share with the White House Task Force.
The directive for HHS to act on remdesivir.
Did not proceed with procuring any supply.
Okay. You were removed from your position on April 22nd. By the time you were removed, had the department settled on a plan and procured the remdesivir?
No, sir. They were discussing slide presentations about potential.
There is one drug the experts say could make a difference, and in fact has been shown to make the difference. Yet the department can't seem to an article on the rollout of the remdesivir, describing it as, quote, confusing, unfair, and marred with incomplete medical, quote. Doctors described how they can obtain the drug and staggering injustice. Dr. Bright, you were warning about this over 3 months ago. If the department had listened to you and the other experts at your agency, could this fiasco have been avoided?
We would have had a plan, sir. We should have had a plan for that drug and any other drug in limited supply.
So it didn't have to be this way. Here's what I don't understand. You were right about the dangers of hydroxychloroquine. You were right about the benefits of remdesivir. You were right about N95, while officials who botched the response and ignored your warning in theirs. Not only is this unfair to you, it's completely dangerous to the American people. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. I have to clarify something just very quickly. Your leave, Dr. Wright. Are you on accrued vacation time now?
Sorry.
Are you on accrued vacation time now?
I'm not approved. Yes,
Would you be willing to share the exhibits once you remove personally identifiable information? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting so comfortable wearing the mask, I forgot I had it on. To share the other exhibits once you remove personally identifiable information.
Yes.
Thank you. All right.
Available this after the hearing today.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, will they be made available to the minority as well as the majority?
The entire
Good Lord.
This is a bipartisan issue.
Thank you.
Might be grading, will that be kept in comments amongst the committee members?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Not knowing what's in the emails, I'm wondering if there's any information in there that might be deemed to be degrading. Would that be kept in confidence amongst the committee members, as opposed to being released to the public? And that is in compliance with Rule 11. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I now have the pleasure of recognizing the only witnesses in the United States Congress.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To those 80,000 plus who have lost their lives and their families as a result of this pandemic, and a shout out to all of our healthcare, as well as our other essential workers who have put their own health in danger in order to provide services to our citizens. Dr. Bright, it's my understanding that in 2017, BARDA funded a project with the private associates of Albuquerque to develop respirators that could be sanitized. Respirators are available for us. How is that? Do you have any idea?
I am not aware of that. So you're talking about
Respirators that were developed and could be sanitized and reused during public health emergencies. It's my understanding contracted and the project was scrapped.
So I'm not familiar with that project. We sanitize the respirators.
You're not familiar with that project, and we didn't sign off on that project. You're not.
I'm not.
A lot of discussion today about hydroxychloroquine, about chloroquine, and confused here because it's my understanding that this is what BARDA. You want to clarify something here? All right, I see you. Okay. Understanding that's what the role of BARDA, the mission of BARDA is to look at things like this. In fact, when we in Congress allocate money to go toward this, that you are supposed to be looking, that BARDA is supposed to be looking at things that could possibly have merit, such as hydroxychloroquine. And early on, it appeared that you embraced that. And early on, it seemed that you were in favor of looking at that. And I'm just wondering, this pandemic, because we didn't have any vaccine or any kind of agreed upon treatment, we should be testing, and that's what we are appropriating that money. Do you agree with that? That's what we are trying to do, is to look at what could possibly work and work with public companies to try to them to come up with those kind of solutions?
Absolutely. We should look at all options and make sure we evaluate the potential risk and safety and benefit of those, and of a randomized controlled clinical study. In the context of emergency, we should move swiftly and get that clinical data as urgently and quickly as possible. But we should not proceed closely without that clinical data on the potential adverse events in emergencies.
So you're referring when you say we should not proceed adversely. Bring the hydroxychloroquine and the chloroquine?
We were promoting the standing up of randomized controlled clinical studies at NIH with hydroxychloroquine. I worked with a company to even ask if they would donate drug to the NIH to be used in a randomized controlled clinical study.
Right.
Yes, so that is what BARDA would do.
And in fact, I think you worked with the FDA to get an emergency use for chloroquine. Is that correct? And it was actually approved by the FDA.
That was in the context of the directive we received from the Secretary's office to stand up and express.
Are you saying you were instructed to do that and you did it against your will, or?
We were instructed to put in place an access protocol. So in the context that Americans would have access to the drug and not be under the close supervision of the physician. The scientists and FDA, NIH, CDC, and BARDA work together to change that directive to the context of emergency use authorization with guardrails in there so patients
encouraged by what could possibly be a result of the effect of hydroxychloroquine. When did that change? When did you sour, if you will, on
some of these are really interesting things we've never heard of. So
I understand that, but when did you sour on it?
When it was determined that this drug should be made available to Americans outside the context of a close physician supervision. So I supported conducting a randomized controlled clinical study for hydroxychloroquine at the NIH. When I learned that there is a directive to make it more broadly available.
When did that directive go out?
That was March 23rd.
March 20th, and now that you decided, no, this is not what we should do, and we should not be looking at hydroxychloroquine at all.
I didn't think that was a proper, safe way to evaluate the context of this outbreak. I believe it should be only done under close supervision of the physician. And then we put the EUA in place that locked this only be used in patients under close supervision of the physician. We were satisfied we had the guardrails in place. When an email string followed, that's more.
And who put that directive out?
Time is expired.
Who put that directive out?
Jones, time is expired. You can answer, Doctor.
Which directive, sir?
That it should be put out to the public without physicians approving it.
That directive was an email string that had a number of individuals on it. First came from Dr. Juar, the Assistant Secretary of Health, indicated the White House was asking for that drug more broadly.
So was it because the press was encouraged by the use of this drug that you became discouraged by it?
Nothing to do with politics, sir. I wanted to make sure that Americans were aware of the risk of this drug, only available under very safe.
What is your answer?
Drug had been used for malaria for a number of years. We didn't have a database.
But it's being used in the same dosage for malaria.
Please. And I know that I'm overly generous with both sides of the aisle of extra time, and I'm not going to ask that it be shared over here. The gentleman's time expired. It's a pleasure to recognize
for your being here today. You're doing a great service. I think we're here today because COVID is real. I share the sentiments of many of my colleagues that have expressed the thanks to the frontline workers asking questions. I want to look at the last few months. COVID's really real in my Michigan's the 10th largest state in the country, and we were third in the number of cases for weeks. There until in the number of deaths. We managed to move to fourth place 2 days ago, which is not a number anybody wants to be. I'm alone. A cousin woke up with 104 temperature and was dead that afternoon. There are people still dying, someone I've known. Sunday, Monday, a brother like friend to me, Tuesday and Wednesday. And then the scientific experts, yourself, but Dr. Fauci, other scientists around the country saying to us, if we don't listen, we could begin to see
we're going to see a return. You call it a dark winter. I call it, I don't want to see it. I don't want to see anybody else die. I am losing too many friends that I know and people across our area of expertise, but it's fine. Car safety. We expect our cars to be safe, and we expect cars to be responsible. In that responsibility, we hold them accountable. If an engineer in a car company realized a model had serious defects and warned her management about that, we would all think she had done her job. Now we would be having hearings. And if it was done negligence. In fact, several years before my time, this committee investigated airbag defects in vehicle safety. At the time, the subcommittee's ranking member, Dr. Bird, said, there is no room for going slow when it comes to safety. And certainly, deception cannot and will not be tolerated. Burgess was right then. And our car makers have to be accountable. But what I'm concerned about is that we aren't applying these virus. And I want to learn from what's happened so we keep that dark winter you're talking about from happening. It seems to me, Dr. Rick, that the same way the audit engineer I mentioned should act. You identified serious problems and then suggested fixes, but it can be diagnostic and tests, other equipment, and medicines. Is that right?
That's true. And Congressman, we still have those challenges.
You believe if suggestions were implemented, lives would have been saved and the severity of the pandemic might have been lessened?
Equipment for our healthcare workers. Yes.
So people died because you weren't listened to.
People die because they didn't have appropriate protection in their lives and protect them from getting infected.
The problems aren't limited to just ignoring your advice. The American people are given mixed signals and frankly, some days to simply deceive. Let me give you, frankly, some days to simply deceive. Let me give you an example. It was a visit to the CDC, and at that visit, the administration said, anybody who wants a test will get a test. Was that true then?
No. Still are not.
So even this week, as we're being told, anybody who wants a test can have a test. Is that true in the United States of America?
No. No.
In fact, all the experts say we're doing is only a small fraction of the tests we need to do to be told by the White House vaccine to be developed. This is your area of expertise. You are top immunologist in the world. Was there any scientific basis test in March that we'll have a vaccine in the next few months?
There's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of hope, but that doesn't make a vaccine. A lot of work that needs to be done to make a
Will
vaccine.
we be able to vaccinate people in the next few months?
It's very unlikely.
Young woman yields back. It's my understanding the majority is passive, reserving. With pleasure, recognize the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer.
The minority is reserving for the next.
Because today, I want to thank you for your courage, for helping us do our job to protect the American people. I want to start today by restating what I said at the hearing February 26th with Secretary Azar, right at that table. The key to a public health crisis is trust and credibility. On that day, I urged Secretary to provide clear, credible updates from this administration to the American public. However, your whistleblower complaint and testimony today unveil warnings about personal protective equipment, testing supplies, and vaccine supplies. Over the past several months, I have held countless conversations with doctors and nurses and hospitals and community health centers and our Republican governor and every other person in New Hampshire trying to get access to personal protective equipment, to protect our frontline workers, to protect our grocery clerks. We've been to get testing supplies, and we were told that because we were not a hot spot, we were on our own. And we literally had to turn entrepreneurs flying to China and bringing us the equipment we need that should and could not to
on how to safely reopen our economy. And those efforts is adequate testing, contact tracing, supported isolation, and vaccine development. Your specialty. So I want to focus on line of your addendum to your complaint. It states that BARDA that between 650 million and 850 million needles and syringes would be needed for a vaccine administered here in the United States for everyone to be safe. Your team at BARDA also estimates it could take up to 2 years to manufacture these vaccine delivery supplies. To your knowledge, Dr. Bright, at this time, has the administration placed any orders to prepare for how a vaccine will be delivered when one becomes available to every American?
I learned placed an order, the first order for needles and syringes on May 1st, and another order was placed today.
And were the amounts adequate?
It's for 320 million needles and syringes.
And could you have had access to the vaccine?
Situation would be catastrophic. Always limited supplies appropriately. It is
Yes,
important
yes,
to remember that it's not just the United States with supplies. When I said it would take 2 to 2.5 years to make those, I was assuming there wouldn't be global competition for those limited supplies. Those are not made in the United States, some of them. So
Lack of preparation in vaccine supplies make us more vulnerable to future spikes in COVID-19?
Absolutely.
And do we have enough supplies to both the flu vaccine next winter as well as the coronavirus vaccine?
It's going to be extremely challenging.
Do we know yet of the interactions of the flu season in combination with COVID-19?
We haven't seen that yet. Luckily, in this spring, flu was winding down when COVID-19 was emerging.
Adequate supplies to vaccinate all Americans for COVID-19, does this slow down the goal of fully reopening our economy and getting back to normal that every American wants?
It certainly brings caution and a significant consideration that must be taken into consideration. And we need to make sure that not only the guidelines for reopening are clear to each individual.
All right. Only 3 hours into this.
Otherwise,
I'm done.
So, can I ask you a question? And I know
I need to clean up my mess.
political, and certainly we are all trying
Hmm,
to
interesting.
In fact, I'm very
Interesting
proud of
here.
our state. The delegation and our
Until a
governor
month ago,
are working
we're no
so well
further.
together.
But I'm gonna
Dr.
stop.
Wright, does this virus
I'm gonna come back and listen to the other half
whether
another time. Actually, right at the halfway mark. So, ending the stream. I'll post the link in the